Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the thin curtain of the cubiculum, that's the Roman bedroom, and stepping quietly into a world of flickering oil lamps, creaky wooden bed frames, and velvet shadows that hid secrets you might not survive. The sheets are scratchier than you'd hoped, the walls thinner than they should be, and privacy? Well, it was more suggestion than guarantee. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far this sleepy little history club stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing barefoot on a cold mosaic floor. It smells faintly of beeswax and stale incense, the air thick with the soft soot of extinguished flame. You're in a Roman home, maybe a wealthy one, maybe not. But one thing's for sure, what happens behind these drawn linen curtains has more to do with class and politics than romance. The cubiculum isn't just for sleeping, it's a multifunctional room tucked behind columns or tucked beneath stairs, often the size of a modern-day pantry. There's a low wooden bed with a straw mattress, a threadbare curtain instead of a door, and a little chest for valuables, or maybe perfumes if you're lucky. Above you, the ceiling arches with simple plasterwork, the kind that glows golden under lamplight. Every corner is filled with a whisper, and if you listen closely enough, some of those whispers are, surprisingly, transactional. In Rome, intimacy was a performance of power, not passion. The head of the household, pater familias, had ultimate say over who slept where and with whom. Even if you were married, that didn't guarantee a shared bed. A husband might have his own cubiculum, his wife another, and visits between the two could be pre-scheduled, let's say. And don't expect a do not disturb sign. Most bedrooms open directly onto courtyards or hallways. Want a scandal? Try whispering sweet nothings with slaves walking by and your in-laws just a curtain away. But the bed itself, it had a life of its own. Known as the lectus genialis, it was sometimes the focal point of the household. During weddings, it was paraded through the home. During funerals, it was dressed in flowers to honor the departed. Yes, the same bed might see both the beginning of a union and the end of a life. Talk about multitasking. The mattress, stuffed with straw, wool, or if you were especially unlucky, reeds. They poked a lot. You shift in bed, trying to find a soft spot, only to be reminded that even Roman luxury had its limits. Now, lighting. The glow of oil lamps would cast long, trembling shadows on plastered walls. They'd use olive oil, often perfumed with lavender or myrrh, mostly to mask other, less romantic smells. And trust me, Roman plumbing was revolutionary, but ventilation wasn't. You'd know what your neighbors were doing, whether you wanted to or not. But beyond the decor, it's the rules of the room that really tell the tale. A Roman man might invite a guest into his home and then, quite casually, show off his wife, like part of the dinnerware. Historians still argue whether this was bravado, satire, or a genuine invitation to share more than just wine. Speaking of wine, there was plenty of that. A little too much, usually. And as you recline on your scratchy mattress, you begin to understand this world ran on carefully concealed desires and blunt social control. You were expected to perform your role, whether you were the wife, the slave, the courtesan, or the master. There's a quirky detail that's always a favorite at dinner parties. Some Roman homes had little paintings over the beds showing idealized positions. Sort of a how-to guide for the romantically uncertain. Imagine lying down and seeing a fresco of Venus, Mars, and a very bewildered satyr above you, not exactly subtle. And while we're here, let's not forget the superstition that ruled the room. A small phallic charm, called a fascinum, might hang by the door, meant to ward off the evil eye. Yes, a dangling bronze. Well, you can imagine. It jingled when the curtain was drawn. Talk about mood music. Still, no amount of ritual could fully guarantee a good night's sleep or a good night's anything, especially if you were lower class, crammed 5 to a room, or enslaved, and your sleeping arrangements weren't yours to decide. Choice was a luxury. Consent, often, a myth. You tuck your arm under your head and glance at the flickering shadows. Somewhere outside, a stray cat yowls. Someone drops a cup. The city never sleeps but you. You're drifting through history on a mattress older than empires, surrounded by rules disguised as romance. And remember, this is only the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the toga situation yet. You wake with a start, or maybe you never quite fell asleep. It's hard to rest when you're tangled in woolen sheets and half listening for footsteps beyond the curtain. But don't worry, tonight we're slipping out of bed and wriggling into something far more revealing than pajamas, the Roman toga. Or, well, not you, exactly, because unless you're a Roman male citizen, that iconic outfit is off limits. Togas were never just clothing, they were symbols, declarations, and depending on the folds, a kind of textile resume. And nothing killed the mood faster than a garment that weighed nearly 15 pounds and had to be pleated with the precision of a geometry proof. Let's be clear, nobody wore a toga in the bedroom. You're not seducing anyone in a giant wool burrito. But what you wore, or didn't wear, mattered before and after the act, and it broadcast volumes. Slaves wore simple tunics, respectable women wore long stolas. Prostitutes, however, could be made to wear the toga mulibris, a kind of punitive parody of citizen wear. You see the irony? Women were excluded from togas, unless they were publicly shamed into one. And in Rome, sex wasn't just an act, it was a spectacle of power, and clothing was your costume. Imagine you're at a dinner party, reclining on a triclinium couch, wine flowing, garlands drooping. Across the room, a man adjusts his tunic, bearing a little too much thigh, accidentally, of course. A courtesan tosses her head back in laughter, her stola slipping ever so slightly. Everything is a dance. Everyone is watching. And here's your cheeky fact of the night. Roman men were legally discouraged from covering their heads during intimacy. The idea was to keep the face visible, to confirm identity, and, get this, ensure proper hierarchy. In a world obsessed with status, even your hairline had rules. Historians still argue whether women of high status had more freedom in private than their writings suggest. Some accounts portray noble women sneaking lovers through garden gates, while others insist they were prisoners of propriety. The truth? Probably both, depending on which side of the curtain you were on. Now let's talk about the undressing ritual. There was no sexy shimmy out of silk. No zippers, no hooks. Roman clothes were layered, knotted, and safety-pinned with fibulae. Think of them as very stabby brooches. Disrobing could take a full minute or more, which, depending on the mood, was either a charming slow burn or the world's driest intermission. You fumble with your tunic, imaginary of course, trying to understand how Romans navigated this. The answer, they had help. Slaves were often expected to assist in dressing and undressing their masters, including during moments of intimacy. Yes, you heard that right. Third parties were common. Not in the way you might be thinking, more like silent stage hands pulling ropes behind the curtain. And once the clothes were off, that didn't mean the roles were. A Roman man had to maintain dignity even in the nude. He could be assertive, dominant, even flamboyant, but never passive. That would invert the social order. Even in pleasure, hierarchy mattered more than sensation. Of course, the rules were looser at Saturnalia, the great Roman festival of reversal. During those wild winter nights, slaves became masters, the streets filled with costumed mischief, and yes, the bedrooms got blurrier too. For a brief time you could wear what you wanted, be who you pleased. And then January came, and the togas returned, heavier than ever. But here's a detail to scratch your head over: Roman shoes. You always removed them before entering the bed, especially in wealthier homes. Some even had dedicated shoe slaves. That's right, a person whose job it was to untie your sandals at the right moment. Foot fetish culture? Debatable. Delegated foot care? Confirmed. By now, the oil lamp is dimming again, casting long shadows over a neatly folded pile of linen. You can almost hear the swish of fabric being pulled over shoulders, the tiny metal pin of a fibula clinking against stone, the whispered laughter of someone hoping not to be overheard. You're not sure what's more seductive, the soft rustle of the stola or the fact that everyone's pretending not to notice. And as you lie back down, still wrapped in the idea of that heavy toga, you begin to realize ancient Roman passion wasn't about freedom, it was about performance. And everyone knew their role. You're reclining now, imagining at least, on the edge of a creaky Roman bed. The curtain sways just slightly in the breeze from an open atrium. But tonight, we're leaving the cramped cubiculum behind and heading down a narrow alley where the real business of Roman desire thrived, the brothel. The Romans called them lupernaria, named after the howling she-wolves of legend. Or, if you're feeling poetic, the noises drifting through cracked doorways at night. You sidestep a puddle, hear sandals slap stone, and duck under a low arch into a dim corridor lit by oil lamps and flickering shadows. Welcome to the business of pleasure, Roman style. Forget velvet chaise lounges and incense-drenched fantasies. Most lupernaria were small, cramped, and about as private as a market stall. Picture tiny rooms with stone beds, yes, stone, and thin straw mats for comfort. If you were wealthy, maybe you got a pillow, but most patrons weren't here for a luxury experience. They were here to spend a few copper coins and maybe forget their name for 15 minutes. Oh, and those coins you didn't pay with words or even cash. Instead, you handed over a spintria, a little bronze token stamped with an image of the desired activity. Think of it as history's earliest menu card. It gets better. Archaeologists have unearthed dozens of these tokens around Pompeii and Herculaneum. Some are so vividly detailed they get flagged on modern social media. But they weren't seen as taboo. They were business tools, both literal and transactional. You'd show up, hand over your token, and hope the line wasn't too long. And the walls, decorated like a catalogue. Each little room might be painted with suggestive frescoes, kind of like a try this at home visual guide, or a wish list, depending on how adventurous you were feeling. It was part branding, part instruction manual, part, let's be honest, mild distraction from the general discomfort. Historians still argue whether the women and men who worked in brothels had any say at all. Some were enslaved, others indentured, a few, possibly, freelance. But the reality is sobering. For many, this wasn't a choice but a condition. Their names were rarely recorded, their voices mostly silent, but their footprints remain, worn into thresholds where they waited for the next knock. And yet there's something strangely human about the graffiti scratched into these walls. Some brag about stamina, others insult the previous occupant's performance. One simply reads, "I waited for you. You never came." Make of that what you will. A fun little aside, some brothels had mechanical devices. No, not those. Get your mind out of the forum. These were clever little contraptions, rotating doors, peep slots, or hidden passageways. One Pompeian brothel had a staircase that led nowhere, a decoy for overzealous husbands. Of course, not all pleasure was bought in coins and carved tokens. Some brothels catered to the elite, offering music, poetry, baths, and conversation before any physical encounter. Think of it as the Roman version of dinner and a show, just with more togas and fewer entrees. But perhaps the quirkiest detail of all, some Roman brothels employed greeters, women or boys stationed at the entrance to lure in passers-by. Their job was to shout out specialties and bargains, kind of like a street hawker, but with more moaning and fewer fish. You lean against a cool stone wall now, imagining the hum of voices, the laughter echoing from rooms no wider than a modern closet, the scratch of stylus against plaster as another love note or insult is added to the wall. And just like that, the brothel fades from view. You step back into the street, the lamp flickers again, and the breeze returns. Somewhere nearby, a cat yowls. Or maybe it's not a cat, hard to say. And as you walk back toward your imaginary cubiculum, you're left wondering, was this Rome at its most honest, or its most masked? The moon is high over Rome now, its glow puddling softly in the marble courtyards and temple squares. But we're not lingering in the open tonight. Instead, you're wandering through a garden at dusk, careful, quiet, following the scent of crushed rosemary and warm fig leaves towards something tucked between the laurel trees and columns, a shrine. And not just any shrine. A small statue peeks out from the ivy. It's a little too enthusiastic in its anatomy. Say hello to Priapus, guardian of gardens, protector of fertility, and the most blushingly explicit lawn ornament in ancient history. You blink, it's still staring back at you, grinning. Welcome to the curious intersection of sex and religion in ancient Rome. Venus, of course, needs no introduction. Her temples dotted the empire, filled with roses, doves, and flirty prayers. If your love life was a bit wilted, or if you needed extra charm at a dinner party, you lit incense to her or left her a small bronze mirror, a comb, or a carefully worded wish. She was the goddess of beauty, yes, but also of persuasion. Roman romance wasn't just attraction, it was strategy. But Priapus, he was a different kind of patron. Originally a rustic god imported from Greek folklore, he stood stiffly, at the edge of gardens and vineyards, a scarecrow with an aggressively symbolic warning, trespass and face me. His image was often carved into walls with accompanying verses that veered from playful to outright threatening. Imagine crossing into someone's orchard and being greeted by a carved rhyme promising you unpleasant consequences involving fig branches. The Romans didn't separate pleasure from the divine. If anything, they found the divine within pleasure, and so they filled their homes with little domestic altars, lararia, where household gods stood shoulder to shoulder with fertility symbols. You could offer wine to Bacchus one moment and ask Venus for a romantic favor the next. Even bedrooms sometimes had painted frescoes of mythological lovers, not just for decoration, but as quiet invocations. Mars and Venus tangled in bed, Leda with her swan, Dionysus with, frankly, far too many people and not enough personal space. Historians still argue whether these images were believed to bring luck, inspiration, or just spice. But considering how many have been found in dining rooms, hallways, and even bakeries, one thing is clear. Romans weren't shy about mixing their flower with a little flirtation. You stroll past a wall where once bright paint has faded to whispers. The figure of a nymph smiles eternally, her robes swirling in a breeze that hasn't blown for 2,000 years. She watches over a fountain, now dry, a place where lovers may have paused or plotted. There's something oddly comforting about how openly sensual these spaces were, not lurid, not crude, just part of life, like olive oil or sandals. Desire was part of the divine rhythm, not hidden or hushed. Even the festivals bore this out. The Vernalia, for instance, a feast of wine and Venus, encouraged both the grape harvest and romantic confessions. Men and women drank under vine-laced pergolas, tossed flowers into fountains, and made sacrifices for love, or at least for a tolerable date night. And in the more rural corners of the empire, little charms were buried beneath beds, small clay tokens shaped like animals, phallic amulets worn around the neck. You imagine a nervous bride on her wedding night, clutching one like a talisman, whispering a prayer to a goddess whose name no longer survives. And then there's the music. Flutes, drums, and the sistrum, a kind of sacred rattle borrowed from Egyptian rites. These were not soft lullabies. They were pulsing, earthy rhythms meant to stir something deeper. Sensuality wasn't just physical, it was atmospheric. You pause in front of another statue, this one barely 2 feet tall, carved in white marble. It's Cupid, chubby and sly, holding a torch. His smile is knowing. Or smug, hard to tell. And you wonder, did Roman lovers ever pray not to fall in love, to resist, rather than surrender? Probably, and just as likely, it didn't work. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Roman brides were anointed with saffron before the wedding night. Not just for fragrance, but because saffron was believed to arouse passion, which, when you're sharing a mattress stuffed with straw and an audience of curious in-laws, probably helps. The wind rustles again, and the garden shimmers in silver. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre plucks a lazy tune. You're not sure if it's real or just memory, but as you tiptoe back toward the shadowed colonnade, you feel it, that thread between the sacred and the sensual, tied not with shame, but with ritual. In ancient Rome, even a kiss could be an offering. You're back inside now. The garden behind you fades into murmurs of crickets and creaking cypress, and you're once again standing in the dim hush of a Roman domus. But this time, you're not alone. The bed ahead is freshly made, though let's not pretend it's particularly plush, and two figures occupy the space. You pause at the threshold, curtain drawn just enough to let the flicker of lamplight spill across tangled limbs and tired silk. Tonight we're not just peeking into Roman intimacy, we're decoding its choreography. Because in ancient Rome, who was with whom and how told you everything about who mattered. Let's begin gently, with a fundamental fact. Roman intimacy was rarely about mutual pleasure. It was about dominance, about roles, and whether the act occurred in a brothel, a garden, or behind velvet curtains, it was a social contract written not in ink, but in sweat, whispers, and carefully choreographed motion. The man on top, he was in control. The one underneath, likely less so. That wasn't just preference, it was structure. Romans divided intimacy into active and passive roles. Only free male citizens were entitled to the active one. To reverse that was to invite scandal, or satire. Satirists like Juvenal had a field day mocking senators accused of switching roles, because in a society obsessed with hierarchy, even your bedroom had a pecking order. You lie back and imagine this, a nobleman boasting not about what he did last night, but how properly he did it. Properly, babab in Roman terms, meant never compromising your status. He might indulge in a courtesan, a slave, or even another man, but never another citizen's wife. Or at least not without consequences. That would be adultery, and adultery could lead to exile, or worse, being mentioned in a bad poem. Historians still argue whether this obsession with control created a more repressed society, or just one that was better at pretending. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, as it usually does in societies both proud and paranoid. Now brace yourself for tonight's oddball fact. There's a Roman graffiti drawing, possibly the world's oldest stick figure comic, that literally diagrams different techniques, complete with exaggerated anatomy and a numbered rating system. Imagine finding that on your Airbnb wall. And those Roman manuals you might have heard about? They weren't quite Kama Sutra. Most Roman advice on intimacy was written in verse. Cheeky, clever, and often sprinkled with warnings like, avoid sleeping after wine unless you wish for embarrassment. Thanks, Ovid. But beyond bedroom mechanics, positioning wasn't just about bodies. It was about law. A citizen male who was too interested in being submissive might risk ridicule or political ruin. Which leads us to an amusing aside. Emperor Elagabalus, known for blurring boundaries, reportedly offered large sums to any doctor who could surgically transform him. Whether this is true or tabloid exaggeration, it shocked Roman sensibilities more for its challenge to order than to propriety. And Roman women, their positions, both physical and social, were more complex. A wife, for example, was expected to be modest, obedient, and demure. But in private, many were reportedly sharp-tongued, cunning, and more than a little savvy about navigating the expectations of their husbands. Some even kept secret lovers, bribed household staff, and used coded fans to send signals from across the atrium. Love and war weren't far apart, and both required tactics. You shift in your imaginary bed and listen to the rustle of linen, the faraway clink of amphorae. Somewhere a girl giggles, somewhere else a man curses softly as he stubs his toe in the dark. Life continues. There's something deeply human about how little things change. Even in a world where status ruled everything, where positions were regulated by law, people still found ways to whisper, to laugh, to touch. And yes, there were manuals and mosaics and the occasional oil lamp molded into surprising shapes. But most of all, there was a shared understanding. Intimacy in Rome was never private. It was always performance. So next time you imagine a Roman couple tangled under linen sheets, remember, one was performing power, the other, often, silence. And as you close your eyes again, hearing the last soft sighs behind that curtain, you realize this was no act of rebellion. It was just another night in a city that always watched. The curtain falls again, the room dims, and the candle stub flickers one final time before giving up entirely. But your eyes are wide open now because we're not drifting off just yet. Tonight, you're invited into the most respectable room in the house and the most quietly rebellious, the cubiculum of the Roman matron. Respectable Roman women were supposed to embody modesty, silence, and virtue. Their daily life was a well-rehearsed performance of demure gestures, downcast eyes, and quiet supervision of household slaves. But just like a well-pinned stola, all it took was one breeze, and things started to unravel. Imagine you're a wealthy Roman matron, married at 13, managing a bustling household by 20, and already a mother 3 times over. You don't choose your husband, you don't own your dowry, you technically belong to him. But here's the twist, within those walls, behind that curtained bed, you're not just a passive partner. You are, in many cases, the conductor of your own quiet revolution. And the first instrument in that rebellion? The fan, yes, the folding hand fan. It wasn't just for show. With a flick of the wrist or a tilt of the handle, it became a coded language. One movement meant, meet me in the garden. Another said, I'm watching you. And yet another, far more daring, whispered, not tonight, dear. Even the way a matron adjusted her stola or pulled her veil could send subtle messages to slaves, children, or occasionally lovers. Historians still argue whether these forms of feminine communication were recognized as power or dismissed as petty flirtation. But as we know, when official channels are closed, the underground finds a way. You trail your fingers along a wooden chest in her room. It holds perfumes imported from Arabia, oils with notes of myrrh and saffron, tiny bone combs and pots of coal. These aren't simply beauty products, they're tools. Armor. A Roman matron might never vote or speak in the forum, but she could sway opinions at dinner, influence inheritance behind curtains, and dictate the rhythm of desire from beneath linen sheets. Now here's your quirky detail of the night. Some upper-class Roman women kept body slaves trained specifically to enhance their appearance or hide signs of age. These attendants were experts in plucking, perfuming, and applying homemade cosmetics. Some even used crushed ants as rouge. Yes, ants. Beauty, as ever, had its price. But perhaps the most striking form of power was how the matron managed her reputation. Respectable women weren't supposed to be seen out too often, unless attending religious festivals or funerals. And yet tales abound of matrons who flirted from balconies, wrote steamy love notes, and arranged rendezvous, while technically never stepping beyond the atrium. There's even graffiti in Pompeii accusing married woman by name of sleeping with a gladiator. Harsh? Absolutely. Accurate? Who knows? But even ancient gossip columns knew where the drama lived, in the bedrooms of the supposedly pure. During the Republic, a woman's infidelity could get her exiled, or worse, killed by her father or husband without trial. But by the Empire, things had changed. Laws were stricter, sure, but so were loopholes. Wealthy women hired stand-ins to attend rituals so they could sneak off. They bribed slave girls to deliver messages. And some even practiced early forms of contraception, herbal remedies and peculiar rituals that would make your pharmacist sweat. Imagine lying on your carved bed frame, staring at a painted ceiling of nymphs and doves, calculating risk and reward. One misstep and everything falls, but one well-placed whisper and you gain freedom, if only for a moment. Of course, not every matron rebelled. Many were perfectly content to play their part, but some turned the bedroom into a quiet kingdom. One noblewoman, Julia the Elder, daughter of Emperor Augustus, was famous for her affairs. While her father tried to promote virtue through laws, she conducted public liaisons in the very forum where those laws were written. Eventually, he exiled her, but her reputation never quite died. In fact, it blossomed with time. You glance now at the empty side of the bed. The matron is gone, her sandals neatly lined up beneath a chair. But her presence lingers, in the faded scent of rose oil, in the perfectly fluffed pillow, in the quiet knowing smile of a marble bust watching from the corner. And you realize the Roman matron may not have held the sword, but she knew how to tilt the scales. You're standing in a room lit with too many candles and just the right amount of awkward tension. A tray of half-eaten figs is balanced on a pedestal, and someone, possibly an uncle, is lingering too long in the doorway. Congratulations, it's your wedding night. In ancient Rome, matrimony wasn't exactly the beginning of a romantic journey. It was more like closing on a property deal with matching sandals. And unlike today's notions of celebration and consent, Roman weddings were formal, public, and often alarmingly young. Tonight, you're the bride. Possibly 13, possibly terrified. You've spent the day being dressed, veiled, paraded, and gently lectured by every older woman in your extended family. You wore the tunica recta, a simple white gown cinched with the nodus Herculeneus, the knot of Hercules. Why that particular knot? Because, of course, it was famously difficult to untie. Leave it to Rome to turn disrobing into a minor engineering feat. By the time you reach the threshold of your new home, you're expected to perform a small ritual. You smear oil on the doorway, decorate it with wool, and pretend briefly that you're thrilled. Your new husband, meanwhile, may be a stranger, or a family friend, or an elderly senator with 3 adult children and a very large nose. Inside the bed awaits, and no, it's not just a metaphor. The lectus genialis, or marriage bed, was often paraded during the ceremony and placed prominently in the home. The wedding night itself? That wasn't always a private affair. In some families, witnesses were expected to confirm consummation. Others held off for several nights, depending on omens or scheduling conflicts. Talk about romance. Historians still argue whether Roman couples experienced real affection early on, or whether love was something that bloomed later, if ever. Some letters from husbands to wives suggest tenderness. Others read more like shipping receipts. Package, wife received. Dowry intact. Children pending. Now, a little-known detail. On her wedding night, a Roman bride would often carry 3 coins, one for her husband, one for the household gods, and one to offer at the hearth. Symbolic? Definitely. Practical? Less so. Unless your husband was particularly impressed by pocket change. And while we're in the spirit of awkward symbolism, the veil, or flammeum, was bright orange, flaming orange actually. Why? To represent the hearth and fire of the home, and possibly to ensure you could be spotted in the dark, should you change your mind and bolt for the garden. The pressure was immense. Roman society demanded that elite women marry young and produce heirs. Quickly, repeatedly, no pressure. In fact, Emperor Augustus passed laws penalizing women who remained unmarried too long and rewarding those who produced multiple children. Your body wasn't just yours, it was a civic asset. You glance over at the painted walls. No soft watercolors here. Roman wedding chambers often featured frescoes of mythological unions, Zeus and Hera, Venus and Mars, some more flattering than others. One unfortunate couple in Pompeii had a painting of Medea contemplating the murder of her children above their marital bed. Nothing like a little foreshadowing to set the mood. And what about the groom? Well, he was expected to be assertive, controlled, and ideally not drunk. But let's be honest, the wedding feast flowed with wine, and restraint was rarely the guest of honor. He may have made a grand speech about duty and lineage, only to collapse face down on the triclinium an hour later. Still, for all its strangeness, there was intimacy to be found. Couples exchanged small gifts, rings, carved figurines, or lockets with hair inside. Some left love notes scratched into the plaster of their homes. A few even shared real affection. Roman poets like Propertius and Ovid wrote of lovers who whispered beneath the covers, who memorized each other's footsteps, who found moments of warmth between the rules. But tonight, as the room falls quiet, You can't help but feel the weight of expectation settling like a second blanket. The nodus is being untied, hopefully not with a dagger. The candles are guttering, and two strangers are expected to become a unit. Outside, the city snores. Inside, hearts beat faster, for love, for duty, or maybe just because it's finally over. You close your eyes, listening to the soft exhale of ancient linen, and wonder, not for the first time, how something so personal became a public performance. The candles have long since burned out. Smoke snakes lazily toward the ceiling, and the wedding bed has settled into silence, awkward or otherwise. But we're not staying in the honeymoon suite tonight. No, now you're drifting toward something older, slipperier, and slightly foreign, the Greek influence. Because when it came to love, lust, and literary blushing, Rome didn't invent the wheel. It borrowed it from Athens, and possibly painted a few more scrolls on the side. You slip into a new chamber, one filled with scrolls, incense, and statues that seem to wink in the lamplight. Here, everything smells of olive oil and papyrus. You're in a Roman scholar's library, or, more accurately, his curated fantasy of Greek sophistication. For the Romans, Greece was both muse and mirror. They worshipped many of the same gods, repackaged with Latin names. Aphrodite became Venus, Eros became Cupid. Dionysus, ever the party god, remained mostly unchanged, probably because everyone already knew what he was about. But beyond the pantheon, it was Greek art, poetry, and philosophy that most deeply colored Roman ideas about desire. Greek vase paintings were explicit, detailed, and, by Roman standards, almost poetic. They showed acts, yes, but also intimacy, gestures, laughter, sometimes even affection, which frankly was a little shocking for a culture that preferred its emotions marinated in strategy. Roman poets like Catullus and Ovid took Greek metaphors and ran wild with them. Your lips are my altar, your eyes my compass, your feet. Strangely intriguing. And while Roman society was, on the surface, deeply pragmatic, these verses revealed an undercurrent of yearning, something less transactional, more tender. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In some Roman bathhouses, Greek inscriptions were carved alongside Latin graffiti, things like, "He's mine," or "Euphrosyne has the best laugh." Sweet, slightly territorial, a reminder that even in a society obsessed with status, people still carved hearts into bathroom walls. Historians still argue whether Rome's embrace of Greek sensuality softened its social rigidity or simply made the performances more elaborate. But the influence is undeniable. Greek symposiums, the famous wine-soaked banquets, became the template for Roman dinner parties. And at those dinners, philosophy and flirtation flowed hand in hand. Imagine yourself reclining on a couch, wine diluted just enough to keep your words clever. A lyre hums in the corner. Someone reads from Sappho, her words dripping with longing. Across the room, a poet recites a new ode, one hand gesturing broadly, the other suspiciously close to someone else's knee. Welcome to a Roman night inspired by Athens, half salon, half seduction. Even in education, the Greeks whispered through the walls. Wealthy Roman boys learned to read Homer before they could even tie their sandals. And with Homer came Helen, Andromache, Achilles, Patroclus, a parade of passionate entanglements, tragic longing, and, occasionally, very confusing armor-swapping. The Greek ideal of paideia, the nurturing of mind and character, also seeped into Roman thought. It taught that love could be elevating, inspiring, even moral, which was great in theory. In practice, Romans often leaned more toward praetexta, as in dressing everything in a formal excuse and then doing whatever they wanted anyway. You find yourself now in a villa's garden portico. Carved busts line the wall, each one a frozen Greek thinker staring wistfully into middle distance. A woman passes, her robe artfully arranged, her hair pinned in a style imported from Corinth. A young man follows, reciting something probably borrowed from Plato and modified to sound original. The air smells like myrtle and ambition, and yet for all this admiration, the Romans were never quite comfortable with the softer sides of Greek desire, especially its open acknowledgement of same-sex affection. In Rome, relationships between men had to follow strict rules of age, status, and of course, roles. To be seen as too affectionate, too attached, too equal, that was where eyebrows began to lift. Still, many Romans tiptoed that line, sometimes with elegance, sometimes with scandal. Emperor Hadrian's love for Antinous, a beautiful Greek youth, is perhaps the most famous. After Antinous' mysterious death, Hadrian deified him, built temples in his honor, and essentially declared, "Yes, this was love, and you'll build a statue about it." You pause beside one now, his marble gaze forever turned toward a horizon that no longer exists. It's quiet again. The Greek night has faded into Roman morning. The scrolls are rolled tight, the symposium guests have stumbled home, but the influence lingers in every poem, every painted ceiling, every whispered myth retold under the sheets, because Rome may have conquered Greece by sword, but when it came to the bedroom, Greece had the last word. You step softly down a corridor that smells of smoke, vinegar, and yesterday's stew, and you feel it, that change in air when a room belongs to you only because someone else says it does. Tonight, you're not the honored guest or the bashful bride. You're standing in the space where power sleeps with its eyes open among Rome's enslaved. The household hums, a lamp guttering in a niche, the scrape of a broom on mosaic, a whisper traded between two figures at the stair. The familiar, the household in the Roman sense, includes not just blood relatives, but enslaved men, women, and children who keep everything moving, cooking, dressing, laundering, cooling wines, warming beds. And yes, that last part is as uncomfortable as it sounds, because in Rome, an enslaved body is also a usable object. The law calls a slave a res, a thing, and that legal fiction bleeds straight into the bedroom. You already know the performance rules: active and passive, rank and role. Here they harden. A master can command service, and service can mean anything from untying the nodus Herculaneus to untying the master's anxiety at 3 a.m. Consent isn't a category the law recognizes for the enslaved. Duty is. You hear a curt summons from behind a curtain, the same curtain we peeked through earlier, and you understand why so many mosaics seem to look away. Mainstream fact, softly. In Roman law, a child's status follows the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is enslaved. That cool legal sentence has countless warm faces behind it, and most of them never make it into the poems. You pass the linen chest. Inside are oils and combs and little bronze mirrors, the same toolkit as the mistress's, only here they're instruments of someone else's schedule. One girl knotting a client's hair, another folding stole, a boy in the corner polishing a lamp shaped like Priapus. Remember that garden sentinel with the not-so-subtle message? He glances up as you pass, then back down. Everyone learns to keep the eyes quiet. Not all intimacy flows upward. Slaves loved slaves, openly when they could, secretly when they must. They formed contubernia, unions that mimicked marriage without legal recognition. Two people share a sleeping platform in a cramped cell, trade bread, plan days off that rarely arrive. He carves her a wooden hairpin. She tucks a sprig of myrtle in his tunic. If the owner approves, the bond survives. If not, the market does its work. The anxiety you feel in your ribs? That's the price of loving someone who can be sold by sunrise. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some owners kept favorite slaves called Delicia, pampered attendants dressed in bright colors, taught little songs paraded at parties, and trotted out to entertain guests with clever quips. Imagine being both the punchline and the centerpiece, then being told to refill the wine. Rome had no HR, only household gods and a suggestion box shaped like an amphora, always empty. Yet the story isn't a flat wall of cruelty. There are shelves and cracks and hidden cupboards. Some enslaved people accumulate a peculium, a personal fund allowed by the master, saving coin by coin toward manumission. Some negotiate, turn competence into leverage. The key-bearer who knows where the documents sleep, the steward who manages ledgers. the lady's maid who controls the mistress's calendar. Power in Rome is granular. Even a schedule can be a shield. You catch a low laugh. Someone just made a joke about the benefits package, hot meals, drafty housing, and the occasional performance review in the form of a wax tablet scolding. It's gallows humor, Roman edition. A boy rolls his eyes and murmurs, "At least I'm not assigned to sandal duty tonight." You want to tell him to angle for pantry duty, closer to raisins, farther from bedrooms, but the house hears everything. Historians still argue whether sexual access to enslaved people was a constant drumbeat in ordinary homes or a theme exaggerated by satirists who loved shock value. Archaeology gives us rooms, beds, tokens, graffiti. Literature gives us punchlines and laments. Between them is the daily, unrecorded truth that lived in footsteps on worn thresholds. Some owners drew lines, philosophers wrote that a good master should restrain appetite, govern himself before he governs others, stoic self-help before it became a bookshelf industry. Others baptized their impulses as nature's law and called it a day. The same city that hung Facina charms to ward off the evil eye, remember the jingly bronze amulet by the bedroom door, could be curiously blind to the evil hand. And then there were the grey zones, concubinage. A master might keep a concubina, often a freed woman or enslaved partner, recognized socially though not legally equal to a wife. Sometimes affection grew real roots, sometimes manumission followed, then a proper marriage, then children who straddled the line between two worlds, addressing former owners as Patronus and Patrona. In tomb inscriptions you occasionally hear gratitude. "To my sweet companion who shared my bread." It's thin comfort, but it's human. The enslaved found protections where they could. Charms tucked under mattresses. Whispered prayers at the lararium. Defixiones, curse tablets, scratched with pleas that a cruel overseer lose his voice or that a master's wandering eye wander elsewhere. Are they superstition, insurance? Both. One girl ties a red thread around her wrist. Another refuses to sleep with her head toward the door. A small control in a life of few choices. You recognize the language of little rituals. You've used it yourself before exams and first dates. Night deepens. In the tiny room off the kitchen, a couple in a contubernum share a heel of bread and a story about a market day that didn't go sideways. In the atrium, a mistress calls for warm water and rose oil, and a body slave moves to fetch it with the trained invisibility of someone who cannot afford to be noticed. Somewhere, a baby whimpers, someone's child, everyone's work. Laws tried to police some lines. A freeborn virgin was protected under stuprum statutes. Adultery with another citizen's wife could end careers or at least make excellent satire. But the enslaved slipped between legal categories, visible in ledgers, invisible in court. It's hard to file a complaint when the complaint is a piece of property. You pause by a door, on the wood a casual carving, a fish, a palm branch, two initials, crossing like stitches, maybe a pair who promise to meet at the baths on Saturnalia when roles flip and the city pretends for a few days that the ladder isn't so steep. Remember Saturnalia, the brief season when masters wore slave caps and joked about trading places? It was comedy more than revolution, but comedy can keep a heart upright through a long winter. And the mornings after, sometimes a manumission ceremony, sometimes a sale, sometimes nothing new at all, just the same orders, the same lamps, the same careful map of the household to avoid a certain door after sunset. If you listen long enough, you start to hear the other Roman love poetry, code tapped through walls with bucket handles, a lullaby hummed off-key in a storeroom, a steady breath beside you on a cold platform that your owner calls a bed. No metaphors, no marble, just warmth shared, sleep earned. You take one last look at the corridor. The house is finally quiet. A cat noses the brazier. The broom rests in its corner like a spear retired from service. You think of all the rooms where we've stood, the bride's chamber, the brothel's cell, the garden shrine, and realize this one, the servants' passage, explains them all. Who cooks the feast? pins the veil, trims the lamp, folds the toga, unties the knot. Who pays for Roman desire, with hours, with bodies, with futures? It isn't a comfortable question, but it's the honest one. And if you're feeling a small, stubborn tenderness rise in your chest right now, you're not alone. People reached for each other in the dark then too, sometimes for orders, sometimes for harm, sometimes for the simple, defiant comfort of being held. The lamp gives its last brave wink, show off till the end, and the corridor melts back into shadow. You step away on quiet feet, carrying the weight of what you've seen, and also the slim, steady thread of what survived. Songs, jokes, initials, promises, and the hope, always the hope, of a different morning. You step out from the servant corridor and find yourself blinking in brighter lamplight, an oil-fueled glow bouncing off polished marble and gilt statues. A hush falls over the room, not out of reverence, but anticipation. Because tonight you're entering the chambers where power doesn't just sleep, it indulges. And when the emperor has an appetite, Rome watches its breath. Welcome to the palace. The emperors of Rome lived lives so padded with wealth and ritual that reality bent around them. Everything from their sandals to their sleeping habits became symbols of the state. And their sex lives? Oh, those were the stuff of scrolls, gossip, and sometimes downright slander. As you walk down the carpeted hall toward the imperial quarters, you'll notice the silence, the kind that means people are listening from behind every curtain. Take a deep breath. The air smells like myrrh, spiced wine, and barely concealed scandal. Let's start soft. Not every emperor was a Casanova with a laurel wreath. Some, like Augustus, worked hard to appear modest. He famously kicked his own daughter, Julia, into exile for alleged promiscuity, even as Roman elites whispered that his moral reforms had the scent of hypocrisy. Historians still argue whether Julia's affairs were real or politically exaggerated. Either way, her exile sent a clear message: do as I say, not as I privately do. Then came emperors like Caligula, and if you just flinched a little, you're not alone. Caligula, according to ancient sources, turned the palace into a private theatre of excess. He's said to have slept with his sisters, installed his horse in a position of power, though perhaps not in the bedroom, and once opened the imperial treasury to fund a festival of questionable taste and extremely questionable lighting. Here's your quirky fact. One of Caligula's parties reportedly included a floating pleasure barge on Lake Nemi, complete with marble floors, hot and cold baths, and designated entertainment rooms. Archaeologists found the remains of the barges centuries later. Yes, he had custom pleasure ships. Modern yachts could never. Not to be outdone, Nero, another emperor whose private life read like a fever dream, married two men in separate ceremonies, once playing the groom, once the bride. He reportedly forced a freedman named Sporus to undergo a crude form of castration so that Nero could marry him in a public spectacle, complete with veil and dowry. Some Roman authors mockingly called Sporus the Empress. Was this love? Power? Madness? Historians still debate whether Nero was expressing forbidden identity, exercising imperial impunity, or simply trying to shock a Senate already low on eyebrows to raise. Not all imperial escapades were grotesque. Hadrian's love for Antinous, the Greek youth we brushed past earlier, was almost gentle in comparison. After Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile, Hadrian mourned him deeply, commissioning statues, temples, even a city in his name. The grief was so public, so ornate, that some Romans were uncomfortable. Emperors weren't supposed to love, they were supposed to conquer. But love, like desire, rarely followed orders. And the palace wasn't just about emperors. Empresses and concubines wielded their own subtle power. Livia, wife of Augustus, was rumoured to have run the empire behind the curtains, her influence so lasting that later generations half-joked she'd poisoned rivals with figs. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, was feared as much as revered, accused of wielding sex and kinship like twin daggers. Even slaves in the palace weren't immune from the swirl of it all. Eunuchs, castrated men who often served in sensitive court positions, walked the marble halls as advisors, guards, even lovers. Their bodies were reshaped to preserve proximity without risk, their fates decided before they ever understood what was being taken. And oh, the gossip! Rome had no tabloids, but it had something better, poets. Martial, Suetonius, Tacitus all took gleeful aim at imperial scandals, mixing facts with venomous flair. They painted scenes of midnight orgies, jealous wives, secret dalliances with flute players and wrestlers. Whether it all happened exactly as written is anyone's guess, but the whispers mattered more than the truth. The imperial bedroom was not just a chamber, it was a stage, a weapon, and a mirror. Everything was layered. A sigh could mean affection or blackmail. A visit after dinner might be politics in disguise. Even silence could be charged with threat. You run a finger along the edge of the lectus, an imperial bed carved from ebony, inlaid with mother of pearl. This isn't furniture. It's a throne with silk sheets. Outside, the guards shift their weight. Inside, the emperor rolls over in his sleep, dreaming not of battles or speeches, but of whoever last filled the space beside him. The echoes of palace intimacy don't just reveal what emperors did, they show what Rome feared, that power, once loosened from restraint, might do anything, that a body without limits might desire without consequence. And that desire, unchecked, might consume more than hearts. The oil lamp trembles. The ceiling fresco above you shows Venus, attended by grinning cherubs. But look closer, and you'll see it. A dagger tucked beneath a pillow, a coin left near the door. Even gods knew that pleasure, in Rome, was never just about pleasure. You step back through the chamber, the curtain falls again, the empire breathes on, the palace fades behind you like a long, indulgent dream, thick with wine, rumours, and velvet. You slip back into the city's pulse now, and suddenly everything feels a little more grounded, a little more earthy, because not every Roman seeking satisfaction could afford imperial splendour. Some had to buy it by the spoonful, one suspicious vial at a time. Tonight you're ducking into a cramped stall near the Forum. It smells of fennel, sweat, and very questionable herbs. The sign overhead reads nothing, but locals know this place. It's one of many shadowy apothecaries scattered through Rome, half medicine, half magic, and it specializes in a certain kind of desperation. Love potions. Yes, aphrodisiacs. The ancient world's boldest promises bottled and bubbling behind thin curtains. And while you may scoff now, remember, when Roman flirtation failed, Roman potion sellers cashed in. You pick up a small clay bottle, it rattles when shaken. The merchant leans in close and whispers, "Crushed cantharides, good for stamina, bad for, well, kidneys." You put it back. Here's your quirky fact for the evening. Cantharides, a substance derived from blister beetles, was one of the most popular Roman aphrodisiacs. It caused irritation, flushed skin, and a racing heart, which the ancients mistook for arousal. Science today calls that poisoning, but beetles weren't the only thing on the menu. There were oysters, naturally, garlic, bold choice, and all manner of roots and resins. Some recipes called for wild celery, others for roasted sparrow brains. One especially suspect potion included dried wolf liver mixed with honey and goat milk. Drink before sundown, the instructions said, and avoid loud noises. Solid advice, honestly, regardless of circumstances. Historians still argue whether these concoctions ever worked beyond the placebo effect, or whether belief itself was the real aphrodisiac. The power of expectation, after all, is not to be underestimated, especially when combined with candlelight and a particularly confident eyebrow raise. The merchant hands you another vial. This one's wrapped in red thread and sealed with wax. A philtro, he calls it, a love charm designed not to inflame desire, but to bind it, more spell than spice. Some filters were slipped into drinks, others were buried beneath a crush's doorstep. And a few were, let's just say, applied directly to the target. You tuck it gently back on the shelf. Now, not everyone turned to potions. Some sought amulets, small talismans meant to enhance attractiveness or virility. One popular item was the fascinum, a tiny phallic charm worn around the neck or ankle. They jingled when you walked, supposedly distracting the evil eye. Whether they also distracted dinner dates is anyone's guess. You step outside, and the air feels cooler. Rome at night hums with longing. Not the palace kind, the ordinary kind, the kind that slips into shoulders during a solo walk, that lingers in wine cups long after the last guest has gone, that crouches behind every hopeful glance at the baths. And oh, the baths. If aphrodisiacs were plan B, the public baths were plan A with better lighting. People met there daily, stripping, soaking, gossiping, flirting. A good soak in mineral water, followed by a strigil scrape and a perfumed oil rub, was practically foreplay, not to mention the mirrors. Romans loved mirrors. There were hand mirrors, wall mirrors, polished silver plates, anything to check if your hair still curled just right, or if that amulet needed adjusting. But when bathing and beetles didn't work, there were defixiones, curse tablets. You heard right. Some Romans, rather than stir desire, tried to block competitors. These lead sheets, inscribed with pleas to underworld deities, were often folded and buried in graveyards, wells, or beneath houses. "Bind her tongue," one reads, "until she speaks to no man but me." "Twist his eyes," says another, so he sees no one else. Some were poetic, some were furious. Many included names, descriptions, and even addresses. You imagine the ancient postal service delivering nothing but the dead listening carefully. You pause at the fountain. The moon catches in the water. A girl nearby drops a rose petal in the basin. A boy watches, pretending not to. Everyone pretends in Rome until they don't. Desire in the city was less about subtlety and more about strategy. A well-timed, accidental bump in the market. A borrowed line from Virgil. A shared fig. Sometimes that was all it took. Other times it took 7 coins, a blind priestess, and 3 roasted locusts, though the results there were mixed. And still you can't help but marvel. For a culture so proud of stoicism, so wrapped in law and order, Rome allowed itself quite a lot of magical thinking when it came to the body. Maybe because logic is no match for longing. Maybe because the heart has always wanted what it wants, even if it needs wolf liver and garlic to get there. You walk on. The apothecary's light disappears behind you. The red thread still dances in your palm, though you swear you put it back. The city breathes. Somewhere a coin is being exchanged for something mysterious in a cloth pouch. Somewhere else, a lover whispers a line they absolutely did not write themselves. And you? You smile, because tonight you've seen how even the most rational empire in the world let itself believe in the unbelievable when it came to love. You're walking now beneath the porticos of a quieter Rome, where the laughter fades, the moon glints off terracotta rooftops, and even the pickpockets have gone home. But don't be fooled by the hush. The city is always watching. And so are its lawmakers, because tonight we're peeking into one of the strangest corners of Roman life, how the law tried to regulate what you did in bed. That's right. Even in a culture famed for its frescoes, fallacies, and flirtatious poetry, Rome had rules, lots of them. And nowhere did they feel more awkward than when they tiptoed into the bedroom. You pass a statue of Augustus, stoic, marble, draped just enough to keep this episode PG-13, and you remember, this was the emperor who tried to legislate morality. Through his Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis, try saying that after 2 cups of wine, Augustus made adultery a public crime, not just a private shame. Imagine the state prosecuting your neighbour's affair because, technically, her husband hadn't filed the paperwork fast enough. Married women caught in adultery could lose half their dowry and be exiled to a small, barren island, usually without the +1. Husbands, on the other hand, got a little more wiggle room. As long as they weren't cavorting with another citizen's wife, the law tended to look the other way. Double standards? Rome practically invented them. Historians still argue whether these laws were actually enforced or mostly symbolic, but they reshaped social expectations. Even graffiti reflects it. After the Augustan reforms, public messages about lovers grew more coded, more sarcastic. The tone shifted from "she's mine" to "she thinks she's innocent." And the rules didn't stop with adultery. The Lex Scantinia, a murky, selectively enforced law, criminalized certain same-sex acts, particularly involving citizens in the passive role. Again, it wasn't about who loved whom, it was about who was dominated and whether that was deemed Roman. You could love your friend, your servant, even your favorite poet, so long as you didn't compromise your dignitas. You duck into a narrow alleyway now where two torchbearers whisper and laugh, one elbowing the other. You suspect their jokes are about someone who technically broke a rule last night, maybe several. The city's full of people breaking rules in just the right way. Rome even had fashion laws. Modesty codes dictated how much skin certain classes could show. Prostitutes were required to wear the toga mulibris, a deliberate inversion of male dress meant to signal their availability and legal vulnerability. Respectable women wore the long stola with the veil, and yet styles slipped. Togas fell just so, veils slid, and the lawmakers couldn't stitch modesty into every seam. Here's your quirky fact of the night. Certain perfumes were banned in courtrooms. Why? Because some believed the scent of imported myrrh or cinnamon might unduly influence a magistrate. You heard that right. Aroma as courtroom manipulation. Imagine being declared guilty because you smelled too alluring. Rome was afraid not of sex itself, but of chaos, passion untethered from hierarchy, love that disregarded titles, age, gender, class. So it did what all anxious states do. It wrote laws, it passed edicts, it etched boundaries into wax tablets and expected them to hold. But of course, they didn't. Not always. One famous case involved a woman named Clodia, known for her beauty, her wit, and her unapologetically public affairs. The poet Catullus called her Lesbia, a nod to Sappho, and wrote lines equal parts yearning and regret. When she was later accused in court of poisoning a lover, the prosecution brought up her romantic history as evidence of character. Because in Rome, sleeping with the wrong person could be worse than a crime. It could be a career-ending PR disaster. Still, not everyone bowed to the rules. Some laughed at them. Ovid, the playful poet behind The Art of Love, wrote full instruction manuals on seduction, how to meet people at the races, what to say at parties, which gestures implied interest. Think of it as ancient Rome's How to Lose a Patrician in 10 Days. Augustus was not amused. He exiled Ovid, officially for a poem and a mistake. The poem was obvious, the mistake still a mystery, maybe it rhymed. You find yourself now outside a taberna, its shutters drawn. A couple leans against the doorframe, swaying slightly from too much Falernian wine. Their faces are close, their laughter quiet. And you wonder, are they breaking a law or just bending it? Rome's attempts to legislate intimacy were often more about control than morality. The laws of the couch, as they were jokingly called by some, were written by men who feared disorder, disobedience, and love that did not obey the census. Yet behind closed doors, behind pulled curtains and quiet gardens, Rome continued doing what people have always done, loving who they shouldn't, whispering promises they can't legally keep, and hoping the law was looking the other way. The torch sputters beside you. A breeze rustles the scroll in your hand, a list of do's, don'ts, and maybe, if no one's watching, you fold it, you smile, because in the end, the heart is notoriously bad at paperwork. The city's heartbeat slows as you drift closer to the center, not the political heart, not the temple-studded heights, but something more curious and far more social. You're walking into the Forum, not at midday when it's loud and full of elbows, but just as dawn begins to stretch its fingers over the rooftops. And what are you looking for this early? Well, let's just say it's Rome's version of a dating app. No swiping, no messaging, but still very much about the art of being seen. Because in ancient Rome, matchmaking didn't happen at candlelit dinners or in quiet libraries. It happened in full daylight, at the baths, at the races, in marketplaces, and especially in the public forums. Places designed not just for commerce, but for chemistry. You settle onto a carved stone bench near a fountain, pretending to inspect a scroll. In reality, you're watching the flow of people, togaed men pretending not to flex, women with perfectly arranged veils glancing up just often enough to be noticed. Slaves trade messages, eyes meet. Nothing is said aloud. This is the dance. There were no matchmaking services in the modern sense, but there were go-betweens, usually older women or clever slaves, who passed along interest, set up accidental meetings, or arranged for someone to just so happen to be present at the same shrine, like bumping into your crush at the corner store every Tuesday. With incense, bathhouses too were famously fertile ground for flirtation. You'd undress, oil up, chat between cold plunges and steam rooms. And unlike modern spas, these were public, co-ed in earlier periods and humming with conversation. You could spot a future lover across the palestra, the exercise yard, or impress them with your wrestling technique, which, let's be honest, was less about skill and more about glistening muscles under torchlight. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Some Romans carried little mirrors not to check their own reflections, but to spy on others. One poet writes about a woman who uses hers to admire a man's back while pretending to fix her hair. Smooth. And if you didn't catch someone's attention with your abs or oratory, there were letters. Romans loved writing libelli amatori, little love notes. These weren't necessarily private. Some were meant to be read aloud, posted on doorways, or slipped beneath cups at feasts. You might get one from a secret admirer, or find one etched into a wall for the whole neighborhood to giggle over. Historians still argue whether this culture of public courtship was empowering or performative. The line between flirtation and spectacle was razor-thin, especially for women. A veiled glance could be interpreted as modesty or manipulation. And for men, too much interest could signal weakness, especially if one appeared too desperate. But as you walk past a baker's stall now, you notice something scribbled on the wall beside it. It reads, "I love her who writes. She does not love me. Too bad." It's crude, sweet, human. Graffiti like this peppers the city, sometimes poetic, sometimes vulgar, always honest. In Pompeii alone, hundreds of such messages were preserved in volcanic ash. One reads, "If you felt the fire of love I feel, you'd understand." Another simply says, "Successus was here. He screwed a lot." Well, points for confidence. Some places were known hotspots for romantic rendezvous. The Circus Maximus, with its tight seating and roaring crowds, was a favorite. A young man might accidentally drop a sash or brush a hand in the frenzy of a chariot race. A girl might lean just a bit too far, pretending to cheer. One poet swears by the strategy of pretending to fear the horses just to fall into someone's lap. Ancient pick-up tactics were creative. And then there were festivals. The Lupercalia, for instance, was part fertility rite, part frat party, part dating show. Young men ran through the streets, lightly whipping women with strips of goat hide, supposedly to improve fertility. Women lined up for this. Whether for tradition or flirtation, hard to say. But if your crush just happened to be in the front of the line, nothing suspicious about that. It wasn't all about spontaneity. Parents played a big role in matchmaking, especially among the elite. Marriages were contracts, dowries, bloodlines, political alliances, all neatly packaged in arranged unions. But even within those limits, the forum and the bathhouse offered spaces for private feelings to surface, for glances to become letters, for letters to become poems, for poems to become awkward conversations over figs. And when things didn't go well, Rome had ghosters too. Poets lamented being ignored, dumped, or replaced. Some even carved curses into tablets. May she dream only of me, may her new lover get a boil on his nose. You chuckle. Petty? Maybe. Timeless? Absolutely. You wander back toward the atrium now, carrying the echoes of flirtations past. The morning traffic begins, vendors shouting, donkeys braying, children chasing each other with half-eaten plums. Somewhere someone is writing a fresh note on a wax tablet, trying out a new rhyme. Somewhere else, a girl adjusts her veil just so before walking into the forum. And you realize, for all the laws, rituals and performances Rome wrapped around desire, it always began the same way. One person looking, one person hoping to be seen. The forum melts into sunlight behind you and the din of the city settles into its midday lull. But instead of retreating to a quiet garden or the shade of your cubiculum, you're stepping into a world where things get complicated. You follow a pair of sandal prints through a hallway strewn with rose petals, past half-empty wine cups and the lingering scent of something sticky sweet, like honey left too long in the sun. And then suddenly, you're in a room where the furniture is low, the music is lazy, and there are far too many couches. Welcome to the Roman dinner party. But not the early part, the respectable bit with olives, pickled dormice, and your great-uncle lecturing about farming. No, you've arrived for that part of the evening. The part after the main course, when togas loosen, eyes wander, and the line between conversation and flirtation disappears into the wine. This, dear listener, is where intimacy in Rome slips out of its moral toga and lounges in full view, half joking, half serious, wholly unbothered. Because for the Romans, the dining room, or triclinium, was not just about food. It was a social arena, a theatre, and often a prelude. You reclined on your left elbow, ate with your right hand, and exchanged glances with your neighbour, and depending on where you were seated, you either mattered very much or were barely tolerated. Position at the table wasn't random. The host's couch was the place of honour. The lowest couch was for guests of lesser status, including entertainers, freedmen, and, yes, sometimes courtesans. But don't assume low status meant no power. Some of the sharpest tongues and most influential gossip sources lounged right there. Wine flowed freely. It was diluted, yes, but don't let that fool you. Cup after cup, toast after toast, inhibitions softened, jokes got bawdier. One poet observed that after the fourth cup, the tongue dances and the eyes begin to tell secrets. Here's your quirky fact. Roman dining couches were designed to hold 3 people, closer than your average therapy session and much warmer. Elbows touched, feet tangled, and if someone rested their hand a little too long on your arm, pretend it was an accident, or don't. These parties blurred lines, musicians drifted in and out, dancers performed routines that were somewhere between religious ritual and burlesque. Some hosts hired mimai, female performers known for their wit, their risque recitations, and their ability to deflate egos with a single line. And in the middle of it all sat the host, watching, smiling, sometimes slipping a note across a platter of figs. Historians still argue whether these parties were truly orgiastic, or whether later writers exaggerated them out of nostalgia or moral panic. Suetonius and Juvenal describe night-long revelries with multiple partners, surprise entrances and occasional misidentifications. One famously scandalous banquet involved a rotating ceiling that dropped flower petals and aphrodisiacs on the guests. Another supposedly ended with a lottery, each guest drawing a wax tablet that dictated what kind of entertainment they'd receive in the next room. Were all Roman dinner parties that wild? Probably not. But the idea of them was part of the appeal. They lived in the space between fantasy and memory, between what was said and what was imagined the next morning over barley bread. But not everyone reclined freely. Women at these gatherings were often judged twice over, once for their presence and again for their behavior. A wife sitting beside her husband might be praised for her modesty or mocked for being dull. A courtesan might be flirted with, toasted, and then slandered in verse by dessert. The trick was to navigate attention without being owned by it. Even clothing joined the performance. Tunics fell accidentally. Jewelry was fiddled with just enough to draw attention. The fan returned, not as a cooling device, but as a subtle signalling mechanism. A lift of the wrist could invite or dismiss. A fan held across the mouth could mean, say it again, but softer. You shift on your imaginary couch. The cushion smells faintly of cinnamon and spilled pomegranate juice. Someone nearby is reciting a love poem, badly. A servant refills your cup without asking. Across the room, a guest makes a pun so dreadful that two people groan and one person laughs, possibly out of politeness, possibly from wine. The room spins a little, time slows, and you remember, in Rome, what happened in public often mattered less than what was whispered afterward. A glance across the triclinium could start rumours. A missing earring could launch speculation. A late-night departure, veiled and swift, might become a poem by morning and a scandal by evening. Still, something about these nights feels oddly safe. Everyone knows the rules, even if they pretend they don't. You can play, or you can pretend not to. You can flirt, deflect, recline, smile. And if you're lucky, or clever, you leave with your reputation intact and someone else's ring in your pouch. As the music quiets and guests begin to stumble home, you rise slowly from the couch, the imprint of the night still warm in the folds of your toga. Outside, the stars have shifted. Inside, the cushions remember everything. Desire in Rome was never purely private. But in these half-lit rooms, filled with wine, laughter, and staged coincidence, it could almost feel like it was. You wake late the next morning, figuratively of course, with a dry mouth, faint perfume still clinging to your toga, and a tickle in your throat that might be from last night's laughter or that questionable fig. But the moment you sit up, you realize something. Your back itches, your neck itches, your everything itches. Welcome to the less glamorous side of Roman intimacy, because while we've strolled through candlelit chambers and lingered at flirtatious dinner parties, now it's time to pull back the sheets and take a good, honest look at the hygiene, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Let's begin with the bed, that lovely lectus we've been reclining on. In many Roman homes, it was a wooden frame covered with leather straps or rope lattice, topped by a straw or wool mattress. Over time, and by over time, we mean by the third night, that bedding could house more than just your dreams, fleas, mites, and the true celebrity of Roman discomfort, bedbugs. Here's your quirky fact. The Roman author Pliny the Elder suggested placing crushed centipedes near your mattress to ward off bedbugs. Another recipe involved goat fat and vinegar. And if you're already scratching at your scalp, you're not alone. Personal cleanliness was oddly enough both highly valued and alarmingly inconsistent. Public baths were everywhere, yes. People visited them regularly, also true, but the water wasn't filtered, chlorinated, or replaced hourly. If anything, it was a communal soup of sweat, oil, and gossip. Think of it as a social smoothie with questionable health benefits. Romans scrubbed themselves using a strigil, a curved metal tool that scraped away oil and dirt. No soap, no loofahs, just oil in, grime out, and maybe a slave to assist you while pretending this isn't awkward at all. And after a steamy bath and oil scrape, perfume, gallons of it. Roman perfumes were potent concoctions made from flowers, spices, resins, and oils. Some were delicate, rose, myrrh. Others leaned more into pungent pine forest on fire. The wealthy wore scent not just on their skin but on their hair, robes, even furniture. If you walked into a patrician's home and didn't immediately smell cardamom, someone was about to be fired. Now let's return to the bedroom. The average Roman did not change their sheets regularly. Many didn't have spare linens. And laundry? That was a full-on urban industry involving massive vats, fermented urine, yes, really, it made an effective detergent, and slaves stomping on garments like grapes. So unless you had the resources and staff, your bed might have character, and that character might bite. Historians still argue whether Roman elites truly bathed every day or whether that was more aspirational than factual. We know emperors built elaborate bathhouses, we know mosaics show them lounging in steam. But the average citizen possibly rinsed once a week, possibly wiped down with a damp cloth and crossed their fingers. Even dental hygiene was a bit of a shrug. Some Romans chewed mint leaves, others rinsed with vinegar or wine. A few brushed using frayed sticks dipped in ash or crushed bones. But with no toothpaste, no floss, and plenty of honeyed desserts, breath at close range could be a mood killer. And what about protection? Well, Roman knowledge of contraception was a fascinating blend of herbal trial and error and sheer optimism. They used plants like silphium, now extinct, possibly due to overuse, pomegranate rind, and even crocodile dung as supposed barriers. That last one's Egyptian in origin, but Rome imported it because if anyone could convince themselves this will definitely work, it was the Romans. Condoms, as we know them, didn't exist. There's some debate over whether animal bladder sheaths were ever used, but if they were, they weren't widespread. More common were withdrawal, abstinence, theoretical mostly, or herbal pessaries inserted before intercourse. Effectiveness? Let's just say the Roman population didn't shrink. You lie back, scratching your arm thoughtfully. Was all this tolerated, accepted, enjoyed despite the discomfort? Probably. Love and lust don't wait for fresh sheets or dental appointments. And for some, discomfort was part of the performance. A sweaty, wine-drenched affair at a feast, that was authentic. A tumble on a scratchy straw mattress, followed by a quick rinse and a prayer to Venus. That's life, baby. There were no scented candles, no streaming playlist titled Ancient Ambience. Just the sounds of the street below, the flicker of firelight, and a collective understanding that romance wasn't about comfort. It was about heat, urgency, timing. Still, the itch persisted. Even Pliny recommended a midnight ritual for keeping lovers away from bedbugs, rubbing one's body with crushed basil and whispering the name of your intended while facing the moon. Did it work? Who knows? But if you woke up with fewer bites and a clear conscience, you'd call it a win. So you reach for your imaginary strigil. You scrape away the grime of the night before. You dab a bit of cinnamon oil behind your ears. And you open the shutter just wide enough to let in a little breeze and perhaps a curious glance from the neighbor across the atrium. Because even in a city full of fleas and funky breath, somebody's always watching and somebody else is always scratching. You've bathed, you've perfumed, you've delicately scratched that one stubborn bite behind your knee. And now you're stepping out into the streets of Rome. The sun hangs low over terracotta roofs, casting long shadows across cobbled alleys. And just as you're starting to feel like maybe the day will be scandal-free, you pass a bakery with, well, suggestive loaves. Yes, that's a thing. Tonight, dear listener, we're taking a slow, amused walk through one of Rome's most unexpected and most visible venues for erotic expression, public art. Because whether it was temples, taverns, bathhouses, or bakeries, the ancient world had a habit of decorating its walls with imagery that made you blush, smirk, or slowly back away while pretending to read something else. You round a corner and pause in front of a humble shop, perhaps a tavern or a barber shop. The fresco on the wall, a dancing satyr doing things that definitely wouldn't pass YouTube community guidelines. And yet in Rome, this wasn't shocking. It was just decor. Roman art was bold, graphic, and often hilariously unbothered. You didn't need to venture into a brothel to see suggestive imagery. Everyday spaces were filled with statues, carvings, mosaics, and paintings that ranged from mildly flirty to full-blown what am I looking at. Take the House of the Veti in Pompeii, for example. The front hall welcomes guests with a statue of Priapus, god of fertility, standing proudly and very anatomically accurately with a set of scales. On one side, a bag of coins. On the other, himself. Subtle? It was not. Historians still argue whether such images were purely decorative, symbolic, or meant to invoke protection, prosperity, or fertility, maybe all three. The Roman mind didn't necessarily separate the sacred from the sensual the way we might today. To honor Venus was to celebrate beauty, seduction, and love all at once. And if that required painting a bedroom scene on your dining room wall, so be it. Here's your quirky fact for the evening. Archaeologists found more than 30 pieces of erotic wall art in a single thermopolium, a kind of ancient Roman fast food joint. Imagine picking up your stew and seeing a painted couple mid-clinch above the soup pot. Bon appétit. Even in religious settings, erotic imagery made appearances. In the temple of Venus Erycina, sacred prostitutes once served as part of the worship experience. Shrines included offerings not just of wine and flowers, but of carved symbols of fertility, figurines, phalluses, breasts. It wasn't vulgar, it was divine. And then there's the graffiti. Oh, the graffiti. Rome was a city of writers. On scrolls, yes, but also on walls. In Pompeii alone, hundreds of messages have been found etched into plaster, many of them erotic, humorous, or just delightfully petty. A few favourites. Celadus the gladiator is the delight of all the girls. I don't care what anyone says, I'm better than your husband. Weep, you girls, my Venus has gone, she has left me for the man who bathes in perfume. Some graffiti included actual drawings, stick figures, hasty outlines, even detailed scenes scratched into tavern walls. And again, these weren't hidden. They were public, conversational, meant to be read and reacted to. You could learn more about a neighborhood's dating history from its walls than from any census. You pass another mosaic now on the floor of a bathhouse. At first glance, it's just a geometric pattern, but the longer you look, the more you see. Figures' eyes, limbs. Is that a satyr, a nymph, a senator with very bad judgment? Hard to say, and that's the point. Roman art liked to flirt with you, to pull you in, let you smirk, then make you question whether it was ever serious. Even kitchenware wasn't spared. Oil lamps were sometimes shaped like lovers mid-embrace. Cups depicted amorous scenes in charmingly crude relief. There were dinner knives with handles shaped like intertwined bodies, and perfume bottles that blushed when tipped upside down. So why all this visual spice? One theory, humour. Romans loved a good dirty joke. A little bawdiness was seen as sophisticated in the right company. To laugh at desire was to show you understood it and controlled it. Another theory, magic. Erotic images were believed to ward off misfortune, the evil eye, and jealousy. A household filled with sensual art might actually be a home trying to protect its residents from harm. And then there's the simplest explanation. They just liked it. Beauty, after all, was a celebration. And desire, that was part of life. To depict it, to display it, to joke about it was not shameful. It was Roman. You pause in front of one last mural, a garden scene, quiet and elegant. Two lovers recline beneath a fig tree. A servant offers wine, a dove takes flight. It's tender, not explicit, sensual, not shocking. And suddenly you see it, the balance. Rome wasn't just painting bodies, it was painting moods, love, anticipation, humour, longing, embarrassment, delight. You turn away from the wall and begin to walk again, your sandals brushing dust from the mosaic floor. The images fade behind you, but their effect lingers, like a song stuck in your head, or a half-remembered poem you want to hear the rest of. Because if Rome knew one thing, it was that pleasure could be captured in stone, and colour flicker across a wall in firelight and live on, centuries later, beneath the ashes, still smiling. You slip through the shaded alleyways now, beneath laundry lines and vine-strangled windows, as Rome begins to hush again. The city breathes differently at dusk, slower, softer, like it's listening. And maybe it is, because tonight we follow that most delicate of threads, the words people left behind, not shouted in the forum, not inked in law, but whispered in wax, scratched in walls, tucked under pillows. Tonight you're reading love letters. You enter a quiet room in a modest domus, the kind where the ceiling leaks slightly and the dining bench creaks when you sit too fast. On the table lies a wax tablet, smooth, brown, still warm from the sun. Someone has just written on it. Letters in Rome were how secrets travelled. Not pigeons, not smoke signals, just styluses and wax. Fold it, seal it with a dab of resin, and if you're extra dramatic, stamp it with your signet ring. Now hand it to your most discreet slave, yes, the one who walks like they've seen everything, and hope it makes it to the right window ledge. And these weren't just grocery lists or invitations to dinner. Oh no, these were confessions, apologies, teasing lines, even curses disguised as flirtation. Come to the garden, one letter might begin. Wear the red band, leave before the moon sets. Another? Your absence hurts more than the laurel thorns. Did you smile at him today? I will forgive you, but my door will be closed. Some were even poetic. We know this because poets like Catullus and Propertius loved turning private pain into public art. Catullus, in particular, had it bad for Lesbia, a pseudonym for a woman who was very married and very complicated. His poems swing from giddy affection to nuclear-level heartbreak in about 10 lines. I hate and I love, he writes. Why do I do this, perhaps you ask? I don't know, but I feel it happening and it hurts. Relatable. Here's your quirky fact. Some Romans sealed their letters with a kiss, literally. They would press their lips to the wax or parchment, sometimes even dabbing on perfume, so the recipient could inhale the sender before reading a word. Not all love letters were sweet, though. Some were laced with warnings or regrets or veiled threats. You promised me 4 nights. I had 2. Or the chillingly short, he knows. And let's not forget the curse tablets. Yes, those again, because sometimes a Roman didn't want to win your love. They wanted to interfere with someone else's. A common type of tablet, known as a defixio, might say, bind Marcus's tongue when he speaks to Julia. May his legs tremble when he sees her. May she dream only of Lucius. These were folded lead sheets tossed into wells, nailed to temples, or buried beneath thresholds, tiny letters to the underworld post office. Historians still argue whether these were literal spells or just emotional catharsis in metallic form. Either way, they show how language, shaped by longing, was its own kind of magic. You sit now beside a pile of love tokens, rings with carved inscriptions. I love you, hold me, let luck be with us. Small terracotta figurines, carved birds, paired animals. One particularly detailed pendant shows a couple entwined beneath a tree, the woman holding a mirror. A reminder, perhaps, that love is both reflection and performance. Even tombs spoke the language of affection. Inscriptions like, she lived with her husband for 40 years without ever a quarrel, or the heartbreakingly raw, to my best friend and light of my life, may the gods keep you warm while I wait below. Love in Rome wasn't limited to one style. There was the desperate, the dutiful, the poetic, the petty, letters that begged, letters that teased, letters that simply said, you forgot your sandal again, I kept it. And people saved them, in boxes, under beds, in tiny scroll pouches sewn into tunics. These were treasures as valuable as coins because they proved that someone once chose you, wrote to you, thought about only you. You glance up now as a boy runs past, scroll case slung over one shoulder. Behind him, a girl leans out a window, pretending to water her plants. A wax tablet rests just beside her elbow. You'll never know what it says. But maybe that's the point. Desire in Rome wasn't always grand. Often it was quiet. 2 words exchanged over a loaf of bread, a thumbprint left in wax, a smile that lingered too long across the atrium. And sometimes, when the poets had said too much and the curses had failed, and even the letters had stopped coming, someone would light a candle, take a stylus, and write one more line, just in case. The window shutters creak softly as evening settles in, casting a pale gold over tiled rooftops and the slow, rhythmic splash of water from a nearby fountain. The city feels quieter now, less performative, less rehearsed. Tonight, we're slipping into the stories behind the curtains that rarely opened, Rome's same-sex desires. Because while Roman law and literature often emphasize traditional male-female relationships, especially for the purpose of family, inheritance, and public virtue, desire didn't always follow the census. And Rome, in all its contradictory glory, didn't exactly hide that. You find yourself walking through a shaded portico. 2 boys sit near a column, their shoulders barely brushing. One is sketching lazily in the dust with a reed. The other laughs at something neither of them says aloud. It's subtle, unrecorded, but very, very real. Let's start with what we know. Roman society didn't classify relationships by the modern labels of gay, straight, or bi. Instead, it was structured around roles. Who was active, who was passive, who had status, and who didn't. For freeborn male citizens, this meant they could sleep with women, with men, with slaves, with courtesans, so long as they were always the one in control. To be penetrated, especially as an adult citizen male, was to risk ridicule, legal trouble, and accusations of being un-Roman. That's why some of the sharpest satire in Roman literature involved insults about perceived passivity. A senator who wore too much perfume or had his toga hemmed too high might suddenly find himself the subject of a scroll passed around a dinner party, full of veiled references and not-so-veiled illustrations. But there's another layer, because even in this rigid system of roles and reputation, genuine affection bloomed. Take the poet Martial. His epigrams, short, often scandalous poems, mention affairs with both women and boys. Some verses are tender, some are biting, some are just him, annoyed that his lover didn't show up when promised. You said you'd come by the 5th hour. It's now the 8th. I've eaten the olives, the bread, and my patience. And then there's Hadrian and Antinous. You pass beneath a statue now, tall, youthful, serene. That's Antinous. A Greek boy of extraordinary beauty, he caught the eye of Emperor Hadrian during a tour of the empire. The two were inseparable. Then, one day, Antinous drowned in the Nile under circumstances still debated. Accident? Sacrifice? Suicide? No one knows. But Hadrian's response left no doubt about his grief. He deified Antinous, a rare honor, commissioned statues in his likeness across the empire, named a city after him, and built temples in his memory. He minted coins bearing Antinous' face. People worshipped him as a god of beauty, youth, even healing. Imagine losing someone so publicly and then making the entire empire mourn with you. Historians still argue whether this was love as we define it today, or an emperor's grand indulgence, but Hadrian didn't hide it. And that speaks volumes. There's your mainstream historical fact. Here's your quirky one. In the ruins of Pompeii, archaeologists found a carved lamp depicting two men in an embrace, complete with exaggerated expressions and, well, enthusiastic gestures. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't in a private home, it was in a tavern, hung near the kitchen. The past is always bolder than we think. Same-sex relationships weren't limited to men, of course. Women, though far less frequently written about, also formed bonds outside of marriage, sometimes romantic, sometimes physical, often both. Sappho, the famed Greek poet from Lesbos, yes, that Lesbos, was read by Roman women for centuries. Her verses, soft, aching, vivid, spoke of longing between women with such intimacy that even centuries later, translators sometimes blushed. In Roman law, female-female intimacy wasn't explicitly criminalized, but it was often dismissed or mocked. Roman authors used euphemisms, jokes, and metaphors involving musical instruments and fruit. You know, very subtle. But the relationships were there, in whispers, in letters, in shared hairpins and joint tomb inscriptions. You sit on a marble bench now beside a low wall carved faintly with initials, MF plus AT, no date, no poem, just two sets of letters, side by side, permanent. Historians still argue whether Rome's openness to same-sex desire made it more tolerant, or whether it simply masked control with aesthetics. What's clear is that desire didn't always follow the law or the roles. People wrote each other love notes, they made offerings at shrines, they remembered the smell of a cloak, the sound of a laugh, the way someone said veil instead of goodbye. And sometimes they were punished, mocked, exiled, but sometimes they were simply left alone. In the same way, not every Roman wanted to lead legions or own villas, not every Roman followed the lines drawn by scrolls and Senate decrees. Some lines were crossed, some were ignored, and some were redrawn in the shape of someone's name. You rise from the bench and glance back at the initials. They're fading now, worn down by time and wind, but still legible, like so many of the stories we've told tonight. Because even in a city obsessed with dominance and display, there was always room for quiet love, a glance, a letter, a life. The evening air cools as you wander farther from the chatter of markets and the clatter of sandals on stone. You follow the curve of a quiet road, past vineyards heavy with summer grapes and fig trees bowed under their weight. And then you hear it, the soft cry of an infant in the distance, followed by the lower hum of a nursemaid's voice. Because tonight we're walking into one of Rome's most complicated intersections, where desire meets duty, where pleasure gives way to legacy, and where love, no matter how it starts, often ends in a contract. Welcome to the part of Roman life that came after the seduction, children, inheritance, and the delicate dance of expectations. Now don't worry, we're not turning this into a parenting manual. But if you've ever wondered what happened after the love letter was answered, the bed creaked, and the gods were thanked, well, here's your answer. Roman intimacy almost always came with baggage. Let's begin with the basics. Marriage in Rome was about alliances. Families married not for romance, but for strategy. That meant land, titles, dowries, and bloodlines, especially bloodlines. Because Rome, ever obsessed with order, wanted names and heirs passed on cleanly, and heirs needed to be legitimate. A Roman man could father children with mistresses, slaves, or courtesans. But unless he formally recognized them, those children had no legal claim to his name or his estate. The same went for women. If a child wasn't born within a legally sanctioned union, they could be seen as socially inconvenient at best, or invisible at worst. And yet, life is rarely that tidy. Many Roman households included children from multiple relationships. A wife might raise her husband's illegitimate children as her own. A freed woman might have a child fathered by her former master. A slave might bear a child who would one day be manumitted and even adopted into the family. Rome ran on rules, but it survived on loopholes. Here's your mainstream fact. Roman fathers held something called patria potestas, absolute legal authority over their children. That meant control over their marriages, finances, and even the power to disown or punish them. In theory, a father could sell his child into slavery. In practice, most didn't. But the power hung there, like a curtain in the room, always visible. And here's your quirky fact of the night. Roman parents celebrated a baby's birth, not with cigars, but with a charm necklace called a bulla. Worn from infancy, it was meant to protect the child from evil spirits and gossip, two things in equal supply in ancient Rome. Now let's talk about women. A Roman wife's main job, at least in the eyes of society, was to produce children. Preferably sons, preferably many sons. Fertility was celebrated with rituals, charms, even festival days. The goddess Juno Lucina was invoked during childbirth. Prayers were whispered. Offerings were made. And yet, childbirth was dangerous. Medical knowledge was limited. Mortality rates were high. And, for all the pressure to produce, very little support was given beyond ritual. Still, some women wielded remarkable power as mothers, especially if they birthed sons who survived. A mother of a senator, she might host salons. A mother of an emperor, she might influence policy behind the scenes. Even adoptive mothers, especially those tied to imperial lineage, could wield tremendous soft power. Historians still argue whether these maternal roles gave women more influence than the laws allowed, or whether they simply shifted the battleground from the forum to the nursery. What's clear is that a clever, socially connected Roman mother was not someone to underestimate. And the children? They were born into expectation. Sons were groomed for public life, taught rhetoric, law, swordplay. Daughters were taught grace, modesty, and the delicate art of matching sandals to politics. Some children grew into poets, some into soldiers, some into quiet lives you'll never read about. But all were shaped by the alliances, romantic, strategic, or accidental, that brought them into being. You walk past a villa now. Inside, a small boy is reciting verses to a tutor, while his sister practices her weaving. Their mother watches from the corner, not interfering, but noting everything. She'll write to her husband later, suggest a new tutor, ask about a marriage match, not demand, suggest. That's the Roman way. But not all children were born into marble halls. Many came into the world in servant quarters, countryside huts, or behind market stalls. They played with clay dolls, carried water jars, and learned quickly how much their future depended on the whims of someone else's past. And yet, love bloomed here too. In a letter from a soldier stationed far from home, he writes, "Tell little Gaius I kissed his image in the locket, and that I will return before the olives ripen." In another, scratched into a fragment of pottery, "To my daughter, when the birds return, I'll be at the river bend. Wait for me." Love doesn't care about legitimacy, or dowries, or contracts. It leaves fingerprints anyway. You pause now by a tomb. The inscription is simple. "To Marcus, my son, who lived 6 years, you were the joy of our morning." It's worn, half covered in moss. But the sentiment hasn't aged a day, because in Rome, as in all places, intimacy had consequences. Some joyous, some tragic, some entirely unexpected. And when the curtain fell, it wasn't just about desire. It was about continuity, legacy, the hope that something of you might remain, carried in a name, a coin, a laugh. You move on. The sun finally dipped behind the hills. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries again. Someone soothes them. Maybe it's love, maybe it's duty, maybe it's both. In Rome, they often were. You're stepping off the well-worn Roman road now, following a scent on the breeze. Something salty, floral, and sun-drenched. The buildings thin out. The air shifts. And then suddenly the sea opens in front of you like a scroll unrolling to reveal a secret. You've arrived not in the heart of Rome, but on its shimmering fringe, where desire went for a spiritual retreat, or maybe just a really well-timed vacation. Tonight, we're sailing to the offshore offices of Aphrodite herself, the places Romans fled to when love got tangled, messy, or too hot to handle under the scrutiny of the city's stone gaze, because sometimes you needed to leave Rome to find your heart again. Your sandals crunch across white sand as you arrive at Baiae, the famous coastal town once nicknamed the wickedest place in Italy. Part spa, part playground, part therapy retreat, Baiae was where senators, poets, and social climbers came to sweat out their regrets and start new scandals in the same week. This wasn't your average beach vacation. Roman elites believed that certain landscapes, coastlines, groves, springs, had divine resonance. That healing could come not just from medicine, but from atmosphere. And so they built villas overlooking the sea, each equipped with private bathhouses, terraces, and sometimes a very non-private guest list. Here's your quirky fact. Baiae had floating banquet barges. Think marble-lined party pontoons. One even included a rotating dining platform, not for serving, just to make sure guests got every angle of the sunset and their host's ego. But Baiae wasn't just about indulgence. It was also where people went to cleanse, emotionally, physically, sometimes even spiritually. You might arrive heartbroken, clutching a scroll of love poetry and a box of ashes, figurative or literal, both were common. You'd spend your mornings soaking in sulfuric pools, your afternoons writing letters you may or may not send, and your evenings negotiating closure over figs and wine. And Baiae was just one of many romantic refugees. Further south, you might visit Cumae, where the famed Sibyl offered cryptic prophecies, some of which were said to concern love. A noblewoman might consult her before marriage. A disillusioned husband might ask if his mistress had truly run off with the flute player or was just hiding in the cellar. To the east, over the sea, lay Cyprus, sacred to Venus herself. Pilgrims brought offerings to her temple, combs, mirrors, wreaths, and perfumed oils. Some came to ask for new love, others to curse the old one. Either way, the goddess had plenty of work. Historians still argue whether these destinations were truly about healing or just well-disguised escapism. Did people come for transformation or just better lighting and fewer judgmental in-laws? You wander now through the ruins of a seaside villa. The mosaic beneath your feet shows dolphins chasing ships, tridents raised in joy. There's laughter in the stones, even now. In one corner, a private bath, a plunge pool no larger than a dining table. You imagine a heartbroken poet sinking into its warmth, composing verses that will be forgotten before the water cools. There were even temples of cleansing dedicated entirely to love lost. In Delos, visitors left tokens behind: rings, locks of hair, scraps of clothing. In Ostia, votive figurines were placed at the base of Venus's altar, each one representing a desire released, a hope renewed. Not all these places were exotic. Some Romans made pilgrimages to small countryside shrines, offering fruit or wine at dawn, whispering a name to the wind. Others climbed hills outside the city to write messages on leaves or tie knots in trees. Primitive, yes, but remarkably satisfying. And some just walked. Left the city for a while, spoke to no one, waited, because even in a culture as articulate as Rome, sometimes you didn't want advice. You wanted distance. Even the writers needed a break. Ovid, exiled to the Black Sea, wrote tear-streaked verses to his wife and friends back in Rome. Whether it was love, politics, or a mixture of both that got him banished, we'll never know. But his loneliness shaped some of the most poignant love poetry the empire ever produced. You pause now at a flat rock overlooking the sea. Someone once carved into it. I left Rome with her scent still in my clothes. It's faded, almost gone, but still legible if you know how to look. Because leaving the city didn't mean leaving behind desire. It meant giving it space to shift, to settle, to heal. And sometimes, let's be honest, to smoulder in peace without your aunt popping by unannounced. You breathe in salt, thyme, and the faint trace of fig blossoms. Somewhere behind you, a lyre plucks a lazy tune. Below, waves nudge the shore like fingers asking for one more touch. Desire in Rome wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the silence after goodbye. The walk along the shore with no sandals. The decision not to write back. Or the moment when, far from the city's fire, you remembered how to be alone and liked it. You turn inland again, sand in your sandals and salt still drying on your skin. The villas of Baiae fade into memory as marble gives way to earth, temples to thresholds, and the noise of the sea becomes the rustling of scrolls. Tonight, you're not walking with lovers or emperors, you're pacing beside philosophers who, as it turns out, had a lot to say about your love life. Because in Rome, desire wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was also a matter of the mind. Let's sit down beside a shady colonnade now, across from a school of rhetoric students arguing over the best way to die heroically. Ignore them. Tonight we're eavesdropping on their teachers, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and a few others who couldn't resist turning passion into prose. You may not think of ancient philosophy as particularly sexy, and well, you're mostly right. But that's what makes it fascinating, because the Romans, even as they indulged in feasts, flirtations, and floating banquet ships, were also obsessed with self-control. And nowhere was that obsession more intensely debated than in the matter of love. Let's start with the Stoics. For them, emotions were dangerous distractions, that disrupted rational thought. Love? That was just poorly managed desire. To love was to risk being controlled by someone else, and the Stoics hated nothing more than losing control. Seneca, the great Roman Stoic, advised moderation in all things, including affection. Love ought to be governed, he wrote, like a state. Gently, wisely, and never by the mob. So if you found yourself writing poetry at midnight, lying awake longing for someone who didn't write back, a Stoic would quietly suggest a cold bath and a long scroll on ethics. Yet even the Stoics weren't completely heartless. Some allowed for friendship-based affection, love rooted in virtue and respect. Not passion, mind you, not infatuation, but admiration, the kind that doesn't keep you up at night or result in rash purchases of imported perfume. Now let's saunter over to the Epicureans. Despite the modern reputation of being pleasure chasers, they were surprisingly chill. Yes, they believed pleasure was the highest good, but they defined pleasure as the absence of pain, mental calm, physical comfort, no drama, which meant love was risky business. Epicurus himself warned against romantic entanglements that disturbed the peace of the soul. He once wrote that the wise man does not engage in love affairs, not because he was prudish, but because heartbreak is loud, and love tends to bring along its clingy siblings, jealousy, insecurity, and unexpected poetry at 2 a.m. Epicureans preferred companionship, casual intimacy, and long discussions over cheese and figs. Not necessarily unromantic, just strategic. They'd choose a quiet night with a kind friend over a dramatic rendezvous with someone who wore too much eyeliner and quoted Sappho poorly. Here's your quirky fact. Some Roman villas had reading rooms decorated with busts of philosophers and frescoes of lovers entwined on couches. Mixed messaging? Absolutely. But also very Roman. And what about the cynics? Oh, they went hard. They believed societal conventions were nonsense, including modesty, marriage, and polite conversation. Some rejected clothing entirely. One famously claimed that public intimacy was the most honest act a person could commit. Did they have many dinner invites? Unclear. Historians still argue whether Rome ever really took philosophical love advice seriously, or whether it was more like a particularly intense self-help scroll you read on the toilet. But philosophy was fashionable. Wealthy Romans paid fortunes to study with Stoics or Epicureans. Some wore their philosophical alignment like we wear horoscopes. I'm a Sagittarius, rising Stoic. Even in poetry, you feel the philosophical tension. Catullus mocks Stoics for being cold. Ovid blends Epicurean metaphors into his guidebooks for seduction. And Cicero? Well, Cicero managed to make every love-related argument sound like a court case. He probably wrote sonnets with footnotes. And let's not forget the Platonists who leaned heavily on the idea of love as divine longing. Plato, whom Romans adored, described love as a ladder. You start by admiring physical beauty, then move on to appreciating inner beauty, then finally you arrive at the contemplation of beauty itself. Pure, abstract, untouchable. You know, the kind of love where nothing happens, no one ever touches, but everyone feels deeply inspired. Romans adapted this to justify all kinds of things, from chaste admiration of handsome youths to long-distance emotional affairs that never technically crossed a line. You could pine for someone forever as long as it remained platonic, literally. You sip imaginary wine now, watching a group of students debate whether lust can exist without intention. One says yes, one says absolutely not. One is asleep, the Stoic, probably. It's easy to laugh, but at its heart, philosophy gave Rome a way to talk about love without surrendering entirely to it. A scaffolding, a vocabulary, an excuse. You could feel too much, then cite Epicurus. You could swear off passion, then confess you were simply climbing Plato's ladder. You could write terrible love poetry, then say it was all part of a Stoic exercise in managing your payday. And maybe that was the point. Desire, in Rome, was always a bit unruly. Philosophy was an attempt to cage it, not to kill it, just to organize it, to make space for love without letting it wreck the villa. You rise now, passing between pillars etched with names, students, lovers, thinkers, cowards. They argued all their lives about whether love liberated or enslaved the soul, whether it was noble or foolish, whether it should be pursued or quietly endured. And you? You smile. Because deep down you already know the answer. It depends on the night. The philosophers have gone quiet now, their sandals echoing down a different corridor, their scrolls rolled tight with theories and sighs. You walk on alone into dusk through the outer edges of the city where the marble fades and the dust returns. You pass a fig tree bent low with fruit, a sleeping dog, and a crooked wooden gate. Tonight, we aren't listening to poets or poets in training. We're listening to whispers, the whispers of bedroom gods. Because in Rome, intimacy wasn't just the realm of philosophers or lovers or emperors. It was also the domain of gods you've probably never heard of. Small ones, forgotten ones, mischievous, unnerving, occasionally onion-scented ones. Yes, onion-scented. Let's start at the feet of Mutunus Tutunus. You can say it softly, it won't help. He was an ancient phallic deity, older than most of the Roman pantheon, represented by, you guessed it, a rather conspicuous sculptural form. Newlywed women were sometimes expected to sit upon his statue before their wedding night, symbolically embracing fertility, pleasure, and a rather blunt welcome to married life. Was it awkward? Certainly. But to the Romans it was sacred, or at least traditional. And like many Roman traditions, it mixed solemnity with snickering in equal measure. Nearby, in your twilight stroll, you might come across a roadside shrine to Facinus, the divine embodiment of the phallus. Tiny statues, amulets, wind chimes, yes, even chariots carried Fascina to ward off the evil eye. They jingled, dangled, and often sported wings, because nothing says divine protection like airborne genitalia on a bronze stick. Here's your quirky fact. Vestal virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, were responsible for blessing Facinus during certain rituals. It was said to protect the emperor. Historians still argue whether the rite was symbolic, satirical, or sincerely believed, but the contrast, iconic. And then there was Subigus, the little-known household spirit, believed to govern submission, not in the philosophical sense, you get the idea sense. Offerings to Subigus might include honey, wine, or cloves, anything meant to soften resistance, increase affection, and encourage cooperation. If your partner seemed distant, the problem might not be your breath, it might be an unappeased Subigus. Many homes had Lararia, small shrines in a niche or corner, with statues of Lares and Penates, the guardians of home and hearth. But nestled beside them, sometimes a tiny figure representing a fertility spirit. A crude carving, a lump of clay, something you'd never point out to a guest, but that you'd glance at before drawing the bedroom curtain. You step now into a garden, wild and overgrown. In the middle stands a crumbling statue of Venus Physica, Venus in her natural form. No jewelry, no mirrors, just a soft body, round belly, faint smile. This was the Venus of fertility, not flirtation. Romans invoked her not to seduce, but to conceive. Couples struggling to start a family left her small offerings: grain, milk, figs, even locks of hair. Meanwhile, others preferred to court Priapus, the garden god known for his enormous expectations. His statues often stood with inscriptions like, "This place is sacred to Priapus. Beware if you steal, you'll lose more than your reputation." Poets loved him, housewives feared him, farmers gave him wine to protect their crops, and lovers, they asked him for endurance or forgiveness, sometimes both. But not all these deities were helpful. Some were tricksters, some meddled, some were summoned in moments of desperation. You pass a wall painted with a chalk circle, faint words around the edges. "Venena, goddess of dreams, bring him to me again." Venena wasn't in the official pantheon, she wasn't in textbooks, but she was in hearts, the kind of goddess who lived in wine dreams and restless beds, a patroness of one-night returns, of imagined reunions. Offerings to her were quiet, a stolen thread, a whispered name, the last line of a love letter never sent. There were others: Petunda, the initiator; Liber, the god of frenzy and loosening; even Anna Perenna, invoked in spring festivals where revelers drank themselves into declarations of love, and frequently fell asleep before anything came of it. Historians still argue whether these deities were taken seriously or were part of a broader cultural joke. But then again, can't something be funny and sacred? Romans were masters of that paradox, laughing while praying, praying while slightly tipsy, making offerings with one hand and adjusting their tunic with the other. And maybe that's what made these gods feel real, not remote, not judgmental, not encased in marble and formality, but earthy, nearby, messy, like us. You crouch now beside a shrine barely larger than a shoebox. There's no name, just a curled bit of cloth, a chipped perfume jar, and a single onion, a love spell, a fertility plea, a household ritual passed down by someone's grandmother who insisted that this always works. No one knows, but someone believed in it, enough to offer food, enough to kneel, and so you stand again, dusk curling into true night. The city behind you murmurs in its sleep. Somewhere a curtain is drawn, a whisper is shared, a hand brushes another, asking silently for forgiveness, for permission, or simply for presence. Desire in Rome wasn't always logical, but it was never lonely. Because in every corner, behind curtains, under beds, beside doorways, between folds of laundered linen, there was a god watching, sometimes helpful, sometimes judging, sometimes laughing along with you. The streets are quieter now, though not silent. Somewhere nearby a dog barks, a baby hiccups, a couple argues in hushed Latin. You drift toward the outskirts of the city, where the roads slope into olive groves and quiet tombs line the path like folded arms. It's here, among carved epitaphs and shaded stone benches, that Rome's juiciest secrets sometimes surface. Because tonight we're reading the scandals carved in stone, not in history books, not in scrolls passed around the Senate, but in epitaphs, the last word, the final flourish, the passive-aggressive goodbye note to Rome itself. You might expect solemnity, and to be fair, many tombstones are just that, simple declarations of age, status, and lineage. But others whisper. You crouch beside one now. The Latin reads, "Here lies Livia, who loved not wisely nor legally. May the gods forgive her, for Marcus never did." Ouch. Roman tombs were more than memorials. They were monuments to memory, carefully curated to control how someone was remembered, and occasionally to throw someone else under the chariot wheels. Some were love letters in disguise. To Cornelia, the most faithful of wives, she bore me 3 children, kept my secrets, and laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny. Sweet, human, possibly a little guilty. Others were bitter farewells. He promised fidelity. He delivered poetry and perfume bills. I hope Pluto likes sonnets. Here's your quirky fact. In certain elite families, women were expected to write their own epitaphs before marriage, as a kind of moral contract. One example, I will be chaste, I will be obedient, I will weave, not wander. If I stray, may this stone crack. That stone, still intact, but the records show her husband later adopted 2 children with his mistress. History always has a sense of irony, and while much of Roman culture was obsessed with appearances, toga properly draped, reputation polished like bronze, these inscriptions offered a rare window into what people really felt, especially when the audience was eternity. You pass a tomb marked only with initials, but scratched beneath, clearly added later, is a message. She was more than this. A daughter, a lover, a whisper the family tried to silence, no one knows. But someone, somewhere, couldn't let the original inscription stand. Historians still argue whether we should read these additions as vandalism or grief, graffiti or testimony. But walk long enough among these stones and the pattern becomes clear. Love was messy, memory was competitive, and a tomb was the last chance to win the argument. One particularly biting epitaph reads, "To Tullius, you died too soon, but not soon enough to return the money you borrowed." Another, "She said she'd wait, she did, and she charged rent." And then there are the inscriptions that resist translation entirely. One fragment found near Ostia reads only, "It was good, you know who you are." Short, perfect, a mic drop across the ages, but not all stone-carved scandals were so playful. Some spoke of betrayal, real or imagined. A man accused his brother of seducing his wife and built a tomb that featured both their names, and a quote from a legal statute about fraud. The pettiness? Immortal. Others aired generational grievances. One mother's epitaph thanks her children for never forgetting her birthday, which sounds nice until you realize it was carved by her, not them. Even freed people, former slaves who gained citizenship, left behind stories of passion and resentment. One man wrote, "I was her master, then her husband, then her fool, now I am free again." Oof. But these stones weren't just about settling scores, they were also about preserving love, sometimes awkward, often aching, occasionally poetic. One tomb near the Appian Way holds this simple line. "We slept side by side for 42 years. I only noticed her snoring when she stopped." Another more grandiose reads, "Claudia was beautiful, silent, graceful, and never answered back. She's missed for the first 3. And in a tiny rural cemetery, a heart-wrenching dedication. "To the boy who brought me flowers when no one else would, may spring always find your grave." You step away now, letting the moss retake its rightful place. The stars are out, the city behind you still murmurs. And the stones, those quiet keepers of Rome's most human moments, glow faintly in the moonlight. Because while Rome often performed its passions in the forum or in frescoes, the most honest desires, the regrets, the smirks, the unsent letters, are often found right here, in tombs that both remember and resist forgetting. Desire in Rome didn't always end in marriage. Sometimes it ended in marble, with just enough shade to keep the gods entertained. You leave the tombs behind, the air cooler now, tinged with lavender and last light. The city is drowsy, but you're still moving, pulled by curiosity, or maybe something stranger. A shadow crosses your path, and for a moment you hear laughter, unfamiliar, feminine, and echoing. You've stepped into the realm of women's voices, that elusive territory where history often mumbles, skips, or pretends not to hear at all. Because tonight, you're listening to how Roman women talked about desire, when they were allowed to, and more deliciously, when they weren't. Let's be honest, most of the surviving records were written by men, for men, or about men. The female perspective? It's there, tucked in the corners, scribbled in margins, whispered from statues without names. But if you tune your ear to it, the sound is glorious. You start with the poet Sulpicia, one of the few Roman women whose love poetry survives under her own name. She wasn't vague, she wasn't demure, she wasn't writing for a friend. No, Sulpicia writes, "Love has come at last, and it's not something I'd try to hide." Go off, girl. She describes her own longing, her impatience, her bold decision to break social rules and go to her lover's home herself. Scandalous? Maybe. Empowering? Absolutely. And refreshingly modern. If she had a scroll-shaped smartphone, you know she'd be sending midnight verses and muted voice messages. And yet, Sulpicia was rare. Most women, especially those outside elite circles, didn't leave poetry behind. But they did leave traces. Graffiti in Pompeii, for example, tells a different story. A chorus of anonymous female voices etched into stone and painted onto tavern walls. One reads, "Fortunata loves Secundus. May his wife never find out." Another more cheeky, "We made love in the shade of the vine. He thinks I forgot. I didn't." And here's your quirky fact. One woman carved a message near a public bath that simply reads, "The water was hot. He was not." These fragments suggest that Roman women talked, joked, longed, and remembered, just like their male counterparts. The difference? Society didn't carve statues of their words, but walls. Walls didn't judge. Historians still argue whether women in Rome truly had sexual agency, or whether what we see is an illusion, moments of exception rather than rule. But every whisper counts, every carved joke, every shared bathhouse anecdote, every poem passed between friends or tucked into a dowry chest, it all adds up. Even in elite homes, women had tools for coded communication. Fans, jewelry, flowers, each with meanings. A certain arrangement of hairpins could signal availability or disinterest. A particular perfume, worn only on some feast days, might send a signal that only one person would recognize, and don't get us started on letters. Roman noblewomen, especially during the Empire, were avid correspondents. Some wrote to lovers stationed abroad, others to philosophers, one even to a gladiator. These letters rarely survive in full, but snippets do, and oh, how they glow! One reads, "You promised to return when the fig trees bent low. They are bending, are you?" Another, left unsigned, ends with, "Your absence has not cured me, only trained my hunger." You pause beside a modest fountain. A woman fills her jug, glancing over her shoulder, as if checking for someone. Maybe a lover, maybe a rival, maybe a friend who knows the whole story. Because Roman women shared stories, in kitchens, in bathhouses, at festivals, over sewing or olive sorting, or watching their children practice rhetoric. Not all stories were grand. Some were silly. He recited poetry while sweating. I forgave the poem. Others were sad. He left before the stars, and I'm still counting them. But all of them show that Roman women were not passive footnotes. They were narrators, co-authors, sometimes even editors. with red ink and a sharp stylus. Let's not forget the courtesans. These weren't your average servants. High-class Roman courtesans, often educated and witty, knew exactly how to navigate desire and power. Some negotiated contracts more skillfully than senators. One famous courtesan was said to auction off her silences. You could buy her company, but for discretion, you'd need to pay extra. And they talked about lovers, prices, competition, sometimes with venom, sometimes with affection. One imagined exchange. He brought me pomegranates. I preferred gold, but the thought was sweet. And the gold? His wife took it back. Not every woman in Rome had that kind of freedom, of course. Enslaved women bore the heaviest burdens, used, passed, rarely acknowledged. But even there, stories flicker, slave girl's name etched beside her mistress's on a shared gravestone, a lullaby passed down, its melody lingering, a song hummed while gathering herbs that held more memory than medicine. You listen now, very still, because the voices are soft but persistent. They come from bathhouse walls, market stalls, temple courtyards, from the corners of kitchens, from the hands of midwives, from the letters that never got answers. And in all of them desire is there, not always grand, not always sanctioned, but always real. Because while Roman men wrote epics and built marble arches to their passions, Roman women carried theirs in bracelets, bread and bruises that faded too quickly to be remembered by history, but never forgotten by the heart. And you, lucky traveller, get to hear both. You find yourself in a narrow alley now, hemmed in by brick walls, softened with ivy and thyme. A single oil lamp flickers above a lintel, casting your shadow long and wobbly as you walk. Rome has quieted, but your thoughts are growing louder, because tonight you're drifting into the shadows of desire. The places it wasn't supposed to go, the names that were left out, the loves that didn't make it into marble. Because as much as Rome liked to boast about its virtues, its laws, its golden statues of domestic bliss, it also had an underground. Not just literal, the sewers were very real, but emotional, social, romantic. Rome's official script favoured the male-female household, the well-behaved wife, the properly arranged marriage. But people don't follow scripts. Tonight, you're listening for the unspoken. And sometimes, the unspeakable. Start with a fact. The Roman world didn't have strict categories for sexual orientation like we do today. They were more interested in roles, who was active, who was passive, who held the power, and who was expected to stay quiet about it. Among men, this led to complex social gymnastics. An elite Roman citizen could take male lovers, as long as those lovers were of lower status, slaves, entertainers, foreigners. As long as you were the dominant one, society turned a blind eye, or at least chuckled behind its toga. But if you loved a man your equal, if you pined, wrote poetry, lost sleep, waited outside his domus with your cloak soaked in dew, that was another matter. And yet, it happened. One poet, long lost to history, except for a single surviving line, wrote, "His voice in the bath made me forget the Republic." Another left a scratched graffito in a tavern wall in Ostia. "Caius kissed me once. I wish I'd bitten him so he'd remember longer." Here's your quirky fact. Archaeologists discovered a pair of bronze medallions in a soldier's barracks, one depicting two men embracing, the other inscribed with the words, "For the one who kept my bed warm during Gaul." Were they tokens of love? Gifts? Inside jokes? No one knows. But they were hidden beneath floorboards, as if they mattered too much to discard and too much to display. And among women? The silence grows louder. Rome rarely acknowledged female-female love unless it was mocking it or punishing it. And yet, the stories flicker through. A poem about two women weaving garlands and touching palms too often to be just friends. A letter where one woman writes to another, "I sleep in your tunic, and it still smells of you." Historians still argue whether these were romantic, platonic, or poetic flourishes. But the longing? That's real. The care? That's clear. And the refusal to erase those whispers, even in the face of legal danger, speaks volumes. In fact, Roman law did occasionally intervene. Female-female relationships were labeled monstrous if they disrupted household roles or inheritance lines. Some were punished, others were simply ignored, buried beneath the larger machinery of marriage politics. But people are sneaky. In the margins of a medical text, a reader once scribbled, "Two women can heal each other better than any potion." Not official doctrine, just truth slipped between the lines. And then there were the performers, the servants, the gladiators, people whose stories rarely reached marble or manuscript, but who lived deeply, fiercely, and often outside the norm. One ex-slave, now running a tavern, was buried beside a man labelled his companion in labour and leisure. Their shared tomb inscription ends with, "Our debt to the gods is paid. Now we rest side by side." You step now into a tiny, ivy-covered courtyard. There's a bench, a chipped amphora, a fig tree just past bloom. On the wall, someone has etched a message, faded but legible. We weren't allowed to love, so we loved harder. You sit with that a while. Because desire in Rome wasn't always grand or glorious. Sometimes it was hidden. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was scratched into stone with a trembling hand and no hope of it being read, except, somehow, by you. And maybe that's the point. You rise again, walking slowly now. The sky is darker. The lamp above the lintel has gone out. But your path is lit by something else entirely, those glimmers of courage and truth that slipped through cracks, leapt across centuries and whispered, "We were here too." You wander now into the faint heartbeat of the city, not the palaces or the forums, but the crooked residential streets where real people lived, fought, loved, and occasionally threw pots at each other. The stones beneath your feet are worn by centuries of arguments over who forgot the olive oil, where someone was last night, and who kissed whom under which archway. Tonight, you're stepping into the most underrated theatre of Roman desire, the home. Because while Rome loved its public spectacles, its baths, temples, feasts, and flirting in broad daylight, what happened behind closed doors, between shared loaves and oil lamps, was often more revealing. Let's slip through the doorway of an insula, a Roman apartment building. It's 3 stories tall, smells faintly of garlic and wet wool, and the staircase creaks like it's judging you. Inside, a family of 5, a dog, 2 birds, and an aunt who keeps forgetting her sandals in odd places. Desire here is practical. A glance across the room, a touch while passing a cup, a whispered joke during the evening prayers. No poets, no perfumes, just affection carved into routine like initials on a cutting board. One woman, married to a bricklayer, left a scratched note near their door. "He fixes walls all day but forgets how to hold me." Another, on a piece of pottery. "She always leaves the lentils on too long. I marry her again anyway." Here's your quirky fact. Roman couples sometimes dedicated small shrines to Concordia, goddess of harmony, in their kitchens, not to ward off evil, but to smooth over fights about laundry or whose turn it was to fetch water. Love, but make it logistical. And then there were the upper-class homes, the domus of senators, generals, and minor gods of gossip. There, love was tangled in politics, alliances, and very expensive couches. A noblewoman might receive letters from 3 suitors, none of whom she chose, while secretly reading poetry from the tutor. A senator might marry for land, inherit a vineyard, and spend his nights writing bad love poems to the flute girl. The atrium saw smiles, the triclinium saw tension. The bedchamber, that saw everything and had excellent acoustics, if the poetry is to be believed. Still, it wasn't always grand. One man wrote on a villa wall, "She loved me more when we were poor." Another, "He built me a fountain, I only wanted time." And then there's the chaotic brilliance of multi-generational homes, where desire existed in whispers, sideways glances, and trying not to be caught by your cousin while sneaking someone through the peristyle. Historians still argue whether Roman marriages were romantic, transactional, or something in between? The truth? It varied, just like now. Some were arranged but affectionate. Others were love matches that soured over garum and goats. And some stayed soft. One husband's epitaph for his wife reads, "She snored, she sang, she forgave, she fed stray cats, she was my home." In wealthier homes, love tokens were exchanged, not just rings but lockets with inscriptions, painted tiles bearing nicknames, even small ivory combs carved with shared jokes. One comb found near Herculaneum reads, "For the one who tames my hair and my temper." You pass through a garden now, not a grand estate, just a patch of herbs, a fig tree, and a weathered bench. 2 sandals lie beside it, one slightly smaller than the other. No statues, no frescoes, just the scent of basil, the buzz of a fly, and the memory of someone sitting too close. This was how desire lived in most Roman homes, not in declarations, but in rituals. The way someone poured your wine, the way they mended your tunic before you asked, the way they whispered your name when no one else was listening. You pause at a doorway where someone once scratched, "She called me idiot," then made soup. I think it was love. And isn't that always the way? Desire wasn't just for poets and emperors. It thrived in burnt bread, late arrivals, mismatched sandals, and apologies that never quite made it to words. It lived in homes where ceilings leaked, babies cried, and yet someone always lit the lamp anyway. Because love in Rome, at its most honest, was messy, inconvenient, and rooted in shared walls, not perfect, but persistent. And as you step away, the lamp in that little courtyard flickers back to life, just for a moment, as if to remind you that desire doesn't always need marble. Sometimes it just needs a place to return to. The city hums in its sleep now, the sky poured full of stars, and every cobblestone seems to sigh under your step. But your path keeps winding, through archways, across dry fountains, and into the scent of night-blooming herbs. You're not headed for a temple or tavern this time. You're headed deeper into the rituals of intimacy, those private customs, half-forgotten prayers, and secret behaviors that shaped how Romans invited love into their lives, because not everything was passion and poetry. Some of it, carefully measured, handed down, whispered from aunt to niece behind hanging laundry. Let's talk spells. Yes, love spells in ancient Rome were extremely real, wildly popular, and frequently written in terrible Latin. There were binding spells where one lover would try to tie the desire of another. You might write your beloved's name on lead, pierce it with a nail, and bury it beneath their threshold. Or, in more aggressive cases, toss it into a graveyard while calling on spirits best left unlisted. One surviving spell reads, "As the wax melts, so may his resolve." Dramatic? Absolutely. Effective? Historians still argue, but that didn't stop anyone from trying. Then there were attraction charms, which were less spooky and more flirty. Perfumed oils, love potion recipes involving herbs like verbena and myrrh, even little charms with carved phrases. "Burn for me as I burn for you." Here's your quirky fact. Some of these spells were sold by street vendors like snacks. You could buy a scroll, a scented sachet, and maybe a warning from the seller like, "Don't use this on senators. They don't fall in love, they fall asleep." And it wasn't just women using them. Men, too, sought mystical shortcuts to affection or at least attention. In one recorded case, a merchant hired a spell writer to win over his competitor's wife. It didn't work, but he got a poem out of it. You wander past a half-collapsed stall. On the wall is faint graffiti. "She drank the potion, then married my brother." Oof, ancient problems. But rituals weren't always so mischievous. Many were hopeful. New brides often performed modest ceremonies invoking Venus, placing offerings of honey and roses at her altar the night before marriage. Widows lit lamps for Libera, asking for clarity, healing, or at least a decent night's sleep. Mothers whispered prayers to Concordia, not just for their children's health, but for their marriages to not be awful. Even household spirits got involved. A woman might sprinkle flour on her doorway or tie red thread around the bedpost to keep love in and strife out. These weren't spells so much as habits with heart, actions that acknowledged how delicate relationships were. And in some communities, women gathered for moonlit baths where herbs were steeped and songs were sung, not for beauty, but for renewal. Wash away the sour words, one chant went. Let him return sweet, or not at all. Sometimes that was the goal, not at all. Because Roman love rituals weren't always about winning someone over. Sometimes they were about letting go, moving on, or protecting yourself from what you once chased. You pass a tiny shrine near a baker's store. There's no statue, just a bowl of wine, a folded cloth, and a single copper coin. A note beside it reads, "For the silence I'm owed." You pause because that hits hard. Ancient heartbreak wasn't different, it just had better handwriting. Historians debate how widespread these private rites were, how much they truly mattered, versus how much was just tradition without belief. But isn't that always the question with rituals, whether you light a candle, tie a ribbon, or whisper to a shadowy goddess named only in your grandmother's stories? Sometimes it's not about whether it works. It's about whether it helps. Ritual is comfort. Ritual is intention. Ritual is saying, I want this badly enough to ask for help, even from the air. And in Rome, the air was listening. You arrive now at a little courtyard where the scent of burnt herbs lingers faintly. Someone's been here before you, maybe hours ago, maybe centuries. On the stones is a faded circle of salt, 3 olive pits and a line scratched in Latin. Come if you must, but do not come with lies. You smile, because that's timeless. Desire in Rome wasn't just flesh and fire. It was ash, salt, thread, hope. It was things said aloud and things only ever mouthed at midnight. It was a cup left outside someone's door, a poem buried under a pillow, a prayer cast into a fountain where no one was watching, except maybe the gods, or maybe just the person you hoped would walk by next. It's almost morning now. You can feel it in the air, the gentlest shift in the wind, the quiet withdrawal of stars, as if even the constellations know it's time to call it a night. But you're not quite ready to sleep, not yet. Because there's one last corner of Roman desire to visit, one that pretended not to be about desire at all, and yet was soaked in it. Welcome to the world of virtue theatre. Yes, that's right. The moral posturing, the Stoic philosophy, the smug declarations of chastity and duty and self-restraint, all of which, ironically, ended up being just as revealing as the bawdiest tavern wall. Because in Rome, sometimes the best way to talk about what you wanted was to insist that you absolutely, positively didn't want it. Take the famous Roman moralists, for instance, Seneca, Cicero, Cato the Elder, men of gravity, logic, and moral superiority. And yet they spent an unusual amount of time writing about other people's lust. Cato once said, a virtuous wife should blush at the mention of her own name. Imagine that as your Tinder bio, but the more they insisted on silence, the louder the truth became. You'd hear things like, a Roman matron must never speak of love, nor entertain thoughts of it. And yet entire scrolls were written defining what a matron could and could not think. That's not suppression. That's obsession with an extra layer of marble. Here's your quirky fact. Elite Roman men often gave public speeches about the danger of women's passion at banquets, while reclining next to hired companions who were pouring their wine. Oh, the irony, aged finely like Falernian red. Even the statues joined in. You'd find sculpted ideal women with demure gazes, one hand modestly on the breast, the other holding a spindle of wool, symbols of virtue, silence, domesticity. And then you'd discover that many of these statues were commissioned by husbands as political gestures, while their actual wives were hosting poetry salons and secretly sending flirtatious letters to visiting poets. Historians still argue whether this virtue cult was truly internalized or simply an elaborate social game. Were Roman women truly bound by modesty, Or were they just really, really good at playing the part? One noblewoman, famously praised in her epitaph for never speaking unnecessarily, also happened to be the subject of 3 anonymous love poems that describe her laugh, her wit, and her talent for winning dice games. Virtue? Optional? Charm? Apparently not. Even the gods got involved. The goddess Vesta, patron of chastity and hearth, had her own cadre of Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to 30 years of celibacy. And yes, they were revered, powerful, and legally untouchable, but oh, when the rules were broken, the punishment was brutal: live, burial. Still, it happened. At least 2 Vestals in recorded history were tried for violating their vow, one with a soldier, another with a poet. One was acquitted, the other not so lucky. But the scandal shook Rome. Why? Because if even Vesta's chosen were tempted, what hope did the rest of the empire have? In truth, this whole culture of virtue was as much performance as it was belief. Roman dinner parties often featured long toasts to fidelity, right before launching into jokes about adulterous gods and the neighbor's new concubine. Even those little moral household inscriptions, the ones saying things like, "A quiet wife is a gift from the gods," were often hung next to phallic wind chimes meant to ward off bad luck. Because Rome was layered like that, they said, "Be chaste," and then decorated their doorways with anatomically detailed terracotta good luck charms. They praised modesty, but their bathhouses were co-ed. They scorned public displays of affection, but their poetry practically steamed off the papyrus. You stop now beneath a portico where a carved plaque reads, "Here virtue reigns." Just beside it, faint graffiti, and under it so does Claudia. There it is again. Rome, always double-speaking, desire and denial, lust and legislation, poetry and pretense. But maybe that's the point. In a culture obsessed with appearance, virtue became just another canvas to paint on, a performance, a role to play, a story to tell the world, while your heart scribbled a much different tale behind the curtain. And sometimes the best way to know what someone longed for was to listen to what they claimed to despise. You linger there a little longer, thinking of all the quiet contradictions carved into this city's bones. The love poems disguised as political statements, the gifts hidden beneath togas, the sighs behind closed shutters, and then you keep walking, because there's one last place left to go before the sun rises, but don't worry, we'll get there soon. The first hint of dawn is beginning to stretch its pale fingers across the rooftops. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, off-key, unapologetic. The city begins to stir. But you're still moving, just a little slower now, as if trying to savor every last footstep. Because this is the final stretch, the last little corner of Rome's tangled intimacy. And it's one most people never think about, desire after desire. What happens when the passion fades, the scrolls yellow, the lovers move on or pass away? What did love look like after the fire? You find yourself in a necropolis now, not the grim kind, but the quiet kind. Rows of stone memorials, tidy hedges, little altars with offerings from the living, figs, flowers, sometimes wine, in little clay cups. You wouldn't call it sad, you'd call it tender, because Romans didn't bury desire, they memorialized it. On one tombstone, a man carved, "To my wife, who argued better than the Senate, and kissed like Venus herself. I'll miss both." On another, "He made me laugh even when the stew burned, especially then." Some tombs were simple, a name, a date, a word like conjunx, spouse, or carissima, dearest. Others read like poems. One reads, "We grew old in the same room. May the gods give you windows where you are now." And here's your quirky fact. In several excavated cemeteries, archaeologists found paired skeletons, sometimes husband and wife, sometimes 2 men or 2 women facing one another. Whether it was intentional or coincidence, we'll never know. But someone, at some point, laid them that way. Historians still argue whether these romantic epitaphs were formulaic, just stock phrases copied from stonemason handbooks. But that theory crumbles the moment you read one that says, He made me angry, he made me soup, he made me stay. Goodbye, my favorite problem. You step now into a section reserved for freed slaves, people who had earned their freedom, often after long service. Their tombs are humble, but the words, they burn. One says, I bought my freedom with coin, I bought her freedom with love. Another scratched into the corner of a shared grave. He never called me his slave, only his. Desire didn't care about class or marble, it cared about memory. In Roman tradition, commemorating the dead wasn't just respectful, it was necessary. Forgetting someone risked leaving them restless, so stories were told, names repeated, birthdays honoured with cakes and wine, and sometimes a few lines of cheeky poetry were left in their honour. One epitaph near a vineyard reads, She poured my wine too strong, I drank it anyway, cheers, my tempest. You walk on, the air cooler here, touched by dew and fig blossom. These stones don't just mark death, they continue love. They say, we existed, we annoyed each other, we touched, we mattered. There's even a shrine to lost love, a small, crumbling niche with dozens of notes tucked into its crevices, written on cloth, on leaves, on old receipts. Some dated, some not. You gently read one. He said he'd be back before the grain ripened. The grain has ripened 20 times now. Another. I don't miss your breath. I miss your snore. People still come here, still leave messages, still ask the same questions. Where did it go? Why did it end? Did it matter? And the city, quiet and ancient and sprawling, seems to answer, yes, of course, look around you. Desire in Rome didn't vanish. It lingered. In tombs, in tokens, in graffiti that defied time, in memories tucked into household corners, in the ashes of rituals, the shadows of lovers, the edge of someone's tunic left hanging too long on a peg. You sit now on a low stone ledge, the sun just breaking past the rooftops. The day begins, the spell of night dissolves. But before we leave it behind, take this one last whisper from a wall in Pompeii. I loved her once. I love her still. Time is a poor match for memory. And in that, Rome gets the final word. The light is rising now, slow and golden, seeping between broken columns and ivy-covered walls like honey over old bread. You're still, finally, in the open, just outside the city gates, where the breeze carries a bit more green, and the morning birds have started their low, almost embarrassed chatter. And in this hush, in this breath between night and day, let's take one last glance back at what we've wandered through. Because Roman desire was never one thing. It was everything at once, fiery and formal, chaotic and calculated, whispered and shouted and scratched into stone. You followed it through crowded bathhouses and lonely tombs, through moonlit rituals and half-sincere marriage vows, through performance, poetry, and the messiest kitchens in the empire. But now it's soft. Now it's memory. Now it's yours to tuck away. Desire, after all, wasn't just about bodies and blushes. It was about being seen, being wanted, being remembered. And Rome? Rome didn't forget, it just buried its love stories in odd places, like a graffito behind a wine stall, a scratched poem on a pot, a shoe left behind in a lover's atrium. You take one last stroll through this place in your mind, a city filled with voices, some still loud, others fading like sandal prints in dust. Here's your mainstream historical fact before we go. Roman marriage contracts often included clauses about affection, not just property. In one surviving scroll, a husband swore to treat his wife as the friend of his soul. And the quirky bit? A senator once tried to ban love poetry from being read in public forums, but secretly wrote odes to his neighbour's nephew. They were found in his personal library, tucked between volumes of Stoic philosophy. Historians still argue whether Rome was a culture of repressed lust or romantic contradiction, but maybe that debate is the answer, because Rome was complicated and desire always refuses to be simple. So now you rise from the stone step where you've been sitting in imagination all this time. Shake off the dust, feel the first warmth of sun on your cheeks. Let the birdsong carry the last whispers away. You made it. You walked through centuries of secrets, hand in hand with ghosts who still have something to say. You didn't survive ancient Rome's idea of love, but you learned how it moved, how it twisted, how it bloomed, how it broke. And now let's ease you into the day, or into sleep, with the softest close we know. So now, my friend, let the story fade like the final echo of sandals on marble. Let your breath deepen, slow and steady like a sleeping city. Let the flickering oil lamps in your mind begin to dim, one by one, each extinguished gently by time and comfort. You've wandered far, from the steamy corners of the bathhouse to the still hush of the necropolis. You've sat with philosophers, joked with poets, and listened to lovers long turned to dust, and yet somehow they spoke to you. Because in the end, these stories weren't really about emperors or senators or temple rites. They were about small moments, glances, softness, a brush of fingers against a cup, a name whispered once and then again into the folds of a pillow. Let your eyes grow heavier now, like parchment, softening with age. Let your limbs rest, warm and loose, like togas draped in a breeze. And if a little voice lingers in the quiet tonight, maybe a line of poetry, or a half-remembered flirtation carved into stone, know that it's nothing to fear. It's just the past tucking you in. Because in this story, you weren't a tourist. You were part of the city. Now, drift. Let the gates of Rome close softly behind you. Let the air cool. Let the morning come, but not too soon. Sleep well, traveller of time. Sleep soft.